The Alpha King found her resting beside his grave, then learned who she had lost. Callum had been walking the outer edge of the burial ground for nearly an hour, when the wind shifted, and carried something with it that stopped him in his tracks. He stood still in the dark, and breathed it in carefully. Human, female, and not recent. This person had been here for a long time. Long enough for the scent to have settled into the grass, and the bark of the trees, and the cold air itself, layering into everything the way a presence does, when it has been somewhere for several hours without moving. He turned his head slowly, and looked down the slope toward the lower section of the burial ground, where the newer graves were, where the stone markers still had clean, sharp edges, and names that the weather had not yet begun to soften. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible from where he stood. He went downhill without making any sound. His boots pressed into the grass without disturbing it, and the branches near the path did not catch or snap as he moved past them. He had been walking these grounds for over 2 decades, since he was young enough to follow his father here, and old enough to understand what the silence of this place required. He knew every tree, every rise in the terrain, every corner where the moonlight hit the stone and made names temporarily bright against the dark. He came around the large oak that had been growing in this soil longer than any living person could account for, and he stopped. She was there. A young woman was sitting on the ground with her back against one of the stone markers, and her head dropped sideways so that it rested against the stone itself. She was not sitting upright the way someone sits when they are watching or waiting. She was sitting the way someone sits when sleep has finished what they could not. Her legs were bent in front of her. One arm was at her side, the hand pressing flat against the grass. The other hand held a small bunch of wildflowers, loosely, with the fingers not quite gripping, the way a person holds something when consciousness has let go of the effort. Several of the flowers had already slipped free and lay in the grass beside her knee. They had wilted hours ago. She was wearing a dark coat with a high collar that was not warm enough for the temperature the night had reached. Her hair was loose and lay across her face and one shoulder. Even from this distance, in the uneven moonlight, he could see that her face had the particular tightness around the eyes and the faint traces along the cheeks that belonged to someone who had cried long and hard earlier in the evening and then at some point had simply run out of tears. She had come here to grieve. She had grieved. And then she had fallen asleep against a stranger's grave. Callum did not move. He stood at the edge of the tree shadow and looked at her, and he was aware that several minutes were passing. Several minutes in which he was doing nothing, when there was an obvious and straightforward thing to do. She was trespassing. She was a human on packland, on the most protected piece of packland that existed, in the middle of the night, alone. The correct action was to wake her, establish who she was, and send her home. This was not a complicated situation. He had handled dozens of complicated situations in his years as Alpha King of the Dre Pack, and this one required nothing more than a steady voice and a clear instruction. He stood and looked at her and did not move. The wildflowers in her hand were a mix of things. Small yellow ones from the roadsides, white ones that grew in the meadows east of town, and 1 or 2 purple ones with thin stems that he recognized as growing along the creek bank. They were not the kind of flowers you bought somewhere. They were the kind you gathered because you were walking somewhere, and you saw them, and you thought of someone, and you stopped and picked them, and tied them with whatever you had in your pocket, and you carried them to the place you were going. She had carried these flowers a long way. He knew because of the distance from the nearest public road, and because of the slight wilting that came not from heat, but from being held in a hand for a long walk. He bent down and picked up a small stone from the ground near his feet. He turned it once in his palm, and then reached out and pressed it firmly against the edge of a nearby marker, producing a short, clear knock. She came out of sleep quickly. Her hand tightened on the flowers, and her head came up from the stone, and she looked at the sky above her for just a moment, taking in the dark branches and the open darkness beyond them, and then she turned her head and found him. He watched her face with care. She did the recognizing fast. She understood that she had fallen asleep outside, and she understood almost in the same instant that she was not alone, and her body gathered itself, shoulders coming slightly in, weight shifting. But what he sensed from her was not the particular sharp fear that humans usually brought into situations like this one. It was alertness, focus. She was awake and processing and deciding what she was looking at, but she was not afraid the way people were afraid of him when they encountered him alone in the dark. She had not decided he was a threat. He did not know what to make of that. She sat up straighter, reached up to pull her hair back from her face, looked at him with clear eyes that were adjusting to the moonlight, and said, in a voice that sleep had made rough, "I am sorry. I did not plan to stay this long." Callum had anticipated a number of possible responses when he knocked the stone. He had not anticipated that one. "You're trespassing," he said. She closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, and then opened them again. "I know," she said. "I am sorry. I will go." She pushed herself to her feet. The cold had stiffened her legs, and she grabbed at the edge of the stone marker to steady herself, and for a moment she swayed. She looked down at the flowers in her hand, and then, without any hesitation at all, she crouched back down in front of the grave and placed them carefully at the base of the stone. She set the stems down first, then arranged the position of each flower with 2 fingers, pressing the bundle gently into the grass so it would not move. She did it the way you do something you have done many times before, not with elaborate care, but with the quick, precise care of routine. Then she straightened and pulled her coat more tightly around herself and looked at him. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Yes." "How long have you been here?" She thought about it for a moment. "I came just before dark," she said. "I meant to leave well before midnight." She glanced upward at the position of the moon, and he watched something settle into her face, a quiet confirmation of what she had probably already suspected. "It's much later than that, isn't it?" "Past 2 in the morning," he said. She received that fact without alarm or visible guilt. The way someone receives information that confirms what they already knew at some level. She looked at him steadily and said, "I'll go. I'm sorry for the trouble." "How did you get here?" "I walked from the main road," she said. "There is a path." "I know about the path," he said. "Why did you use it?" She met his gaze directly. Her eyes were a clear green, more visible now that she had pushed her hair back, and they held the kind of steadiness that belongs to someone who has run out of the energy it takes to perform composure, and has arrived at the actual thing. She was not performing anything. She was simply present and direct and a little tired. "I needed to be here," she said. "I know that I am not supposed to be, and I am sorry for that. But I needed to be close to him. That is the only way I can explain it." The word him arrived in the cold air between them and stayed there. He looked past her at the stone marker. He could read the name from where he stood. He had seen this stone placed. He had approved the inscription. He had stood in front of it at the gathering in October of last year and spoken the name that was carved into it with steadiness and deliberateness. He had done all of that. Tonight, reading it with her standing in front of it, was entirely different. He brought himself back to her face. "These woods are not safe at night for someone alone," he said. "I have been coming here every week for 14 months, she said. "Nothing has ever happened to me." "That is not a guarantee." "No," she said simply. "It isn't." He looked at her. She was not afraid of the dark or the distance or the things that moved at night in a forest. She had made a calculation, and the calculation had come out in favor of being here, and she had been acting on that calculation for over a year. Whatever drew her to this specific stone outweighed every ordinary concern a person had about being alone in the dark. She said, without any particular inflection, "Are you the one who stands in the tree line sometimes?" He went completely still. "I have noticed a shape there," she said. "On a few different evenings. I could never see it clearly. I assumed it was someone from a nearby house, checking that I was not going to cause any damage." She looked at him. "I don't cause damage," she added. "I just come and sit. That is all I ever do here." He said nothing. She was waiting, but not impatiently, and after a moment, she simply nodded once, accepting his silence as an answer in itself. "I'll walk you to the road," he said. She did not argue. She turned and followed him along the path. He set a pace that matched hers. Her steps were careful, watching the uneven ground, and he moved alongside her without rushing her. They went through the older section of the burial ground, through the narrow passage between 2 long rows of ancient markers, and up the slope toward the forest's edge. Neither of them spoke. The night was full of wind, and the sound of something small, moving in the brush to the east, and the steady, faint sound of her boots on the path. At the road she stopped. She turned and looked at him in the clearer light that came from the open sky above the road. He could see her more fully here. Her eyes were red from earlier. There was a small, neat repair on the left shoulder of her coat where the seam had been mended. There was an old, faded scar across the knuckle of her left hand. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. For what? He said. For not making this harder than it needed to be. A brief pause. I am going to come back next week, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. I will not stop coming, but I will leave before dark from now on. She was not asking his permission, she was informing him. And she was doing it in the same quiet, direct way she had done everything else, without apology, without aggression, without any pretense that she was anything other than exactly what she was. All right, he said. She nodded and turned and walked up the road. He watched her until the bend took her out of sight, and then he stood at the road's edge for another moment before turning back into the trees. He walked back to Ethan Morrow's grave and stood in front of it. He had stood in front of this stone many times. He had stood in front of every stone in this burial ground at one point or another, because that was what he believed a leader owed his people, the willingness to look at the names of those he had led and not look away. He had stood at this one in October, with the wind cutting across the hillside, and he had spoken Ethan's name with a steadiness he was proud of, and then he had moved through the rest of the ceremony with the efficiency and precision that the moment required, and afterward, he had carried the grief of it the way he carried all grief, inside, without displaying it, where it could not slow anything down. Tonight he stood in front of the stone and looked at the flowers she had laid at its base, and something in him was not steady at all. He thought about 9 years. Ethan Morrow had been one of the clearest thinkers in the patrol unit. He had been the kind of soldier who did not need to be given the same instruction twice, and did not need to be reminded of anything. He was quiet, but not closed. There was a difference, and Callum had always respected it. Ethan was not a man who kept silent because he had nothing to say, but because he chose carefully when to say it, and when he did speak, it was worth hearing. Callum had trusted that judgment completely. He had apparently not known this man at all. Or rather, he had known a part of him, a specific and true part, the warrior, the soldier, the pack member with 9 years of perfect, unbroken loyalty to his name. He had known that part so clearly and so well that he had never noticed the shape of what was missing. 3 years, he estimated. He was guessing, but instinct and the specific kind of sorrow he had seen in her face told him it was roughly right. 3 years of a life maintained entirely outside of everything in this burial ground, entirely outside of the pack, hidden with enormous discipline and care from everyone who knew Ethan's name. And then Ethan had died following an order Callum had given, and the woman had been given a sealed letter by a stranger at her door, and she had found this grave herself, weeks later, and she had been coming every week since with wildflowers. Callum stood in front of the stone until the cold became something you could not simply breathe through anymore. Then he turned and walked home. He sat at his kitchen table. He made coffee, and forgot it was there. Outside, the sky moved through the phases of pre-dawn darkness, going from the deep black of midnight to the faintly warmer dark that came a few hours before the light, and he sat in the silence and did not sleep. He got up eventually and went to the cabinet where he kept his personal records, the notebook in his own handwriting that held what the formal registers did not. He found the entry. He read it. He looked at the line that said, "No recorded mate, no known family connections," and he kept his eyes on those words for a long time. Then he closed the book and put it back and sat down again. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. He went to the window and watched the sky lighten in the east, that slow, pale process that the night made look impossible every time, and that happened anyway. The birds started somewhere in the trees to the north. First one, then 3, then more. The air was still cold, but something in it had changed, the particular shift of temperature and weight that came just before the light. He told himself he needed to speak to Owen. His beta would know if there had ever been any sign, any slip, anything that might have pointed toward a hidden connection in Ethan's life. Owen noticed things. That was one of the things that made him valuable beyond the ordinary duties of his rank. He also told himself to think carefully about what he was doing. He was the Alpha King. He had responsibilities to the pack, to the land, to the laws and the traditions that the burial ground represented. A woman coming onto this land every week, alone, without any formal claim or standing, was not a small thing to ignore. It needed to be addressed. It needed to be handled properly and clearly. He told himself all of this very sensibly while watching the sunrise. Then he thought about her hands pressing wilted flowers into the grass at the base of that stone, with the particular care of someone who had been doing it long enough to have a method. He picked up his coat and went to find Owen. Owen was not surprised to be woken before sunrise. It had happened often enough over the years that he had stopped needing a few minutes to become fully alert. He was awake the moment Callum knocked, his beta instincts doing the work that ordinary sleep resisted. He came to the door of the small stone house at the edge of the pack's main property, already dressed, already watching Callum's face, already understanding from the quality of the silence around his alpha that something had happened in the night. He listened without interrupting. That was one of Owen's greatest strengths. He could hold a very long silence without filling it, without shifting or gesturing or rushing the person on the other side of it. He stood in his doorway with his arms crossed, and his expression even while Callum told him what had happened in the burial ground, and he did not say anything until Callum finished. Then he said, "I didn't know." "I'm not asking if you knew," Callum said. "I'm asking if you ever noticed anything. Any time Ethan left the territory on a regular schedule, any mention of the town below the valley, any sign that he had a connection outside the pack that no one was aware of." Owen was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who did not answer questions carelessly, and Callum had always trusted that about him. When Owen said he didn't know something, you believed him. When Owen said he thought he had noticed something, you listened closely. "He went to the market in town on Tuesdays," Owen said finally. "Most of the patrol unit did at one point or another. He went more often than the others, but I took that as a personal preference. He also went on some Saturdays. He was never gone more than 12 hours. He always came back prompt." Owen looked at the ground for a moment. "I never thought to question it. Ethan was the last person in the unit I would have questioned about anything." "That's the thing about trust," Callum said. "It stops you looking." Owen nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need to know who she is," Callum said, quietly. "I don't want this to become a conversation in the pack before I have a clear picture of what we are dealing with. Go to the town. Find out what you can. Her name is Lyra. She is young, green eyes, dark hair, probably around 28. She works somewhere in the lower market district. Based on the wildflowers she brought last night, my guess is a flower shop or something connected to one." Owen took that in without writing anything down. He would not need to. "How much do you want?" "Everything," Callum said, "but carefully." Owen left within the hour. Callum went back to the house and stood in his study for a while, without sitting down, looking at the bookcase against the far wall without seeing it, thinking about Ethan Morrow, the way you think about someone once you have discovered there is a room inside them you never entered. He had been a good soldier. No, more than that. Ethan had been the kind of person whose presence in a unit changed the quality of everything around him, not because he was loud or inspiring or given to speeches, but because he was reliable in the deep, quiet way that meant people around him trusted the ground they were standing on. You knew that if Ethan Morrow said something was under control, it was under control. You knew that if he said a plan was sound, it was sound. You knew that if he looked worried, you should be worried too. Callum had built his trust in Ethan over 9 years, through dozens of shared situations, some of them difficult, some of them dangerous. He had built it through the accumulation of small, reliable moments that stacked up over time, until the trust was something you did not even consciously think about anymore. It simply existed. And underneath all of that, unknown to any of them, there had been a woman in the town below the valley who was making wildflower arrangements and counting the days until Tuesday. He sat down at his desk eventually. He had things to attend to. The running of a pack of 83 people across 3 properties and 2 generations was not a task that paused, because its Alpha King had spent a sleepless night thinking about a woman who pressed flowers into cemetery grass. He made himself work through the correspondence that had been sitting on his desk since the previous evening. He read the report Owen had left him on the status of the northern boundary. He answered 3 separate requests that had been waiting for his attention. He did all of it slowly and without much concentration, and somewhere in the middle of it, he stopped pretending he was not thinking about the burial ground and let himself think about it properly. In the lower market district of the town below the valley, Lyra Hale was unlocking the front door of a small flower shop called Seasons. The shop had been her employer for 4 years, and her responsibility for the past 2, since the original owner, a woman named Ruth who was 73, and had decided her knees were done with standing for 8-hour stretches, had passed the daily running of it to Lyra, with a handshake and a brief, emotional lunch. Ruth still came by on Thursdays. She sat in the chair by the window and offered opinions on the arrangements in the display case, and occasionally helped with the more delicate work. But the shop was Lyra's now, in everything but the name on the deed, and she had come to think of it as hers, in the way you come to think of any place that holds both your work and your grief. She turned the sign from closed to open and went to the back room to begin the morning tasks. There were deliveries to sort through. There was a large order for a wedding happening on Saturday that needed 2 more days of preparation. There were the small daily arrangements that went into the display case for walk-in customers, the ones who came in looking for something to bring to a dinner party or something to leave on a kitchen table at home. She moved through the familiar work with the automatic efficiency of long practice, her hands finding the right stems and the right water and the right vessels, without requiring much direction from her mind. Her mind was elsewhere. She kept returning to the man at the burial ground. She had seen him twice before, in previous weeks, standing in the trees at the edge of the moonlight, a shape, a shadow, present but still. She had been coming to that grave for over a year, and she had never had any interaction with the land around it. No one had ever come out of the trees. No one had ever questioned her, or followed her, or made any move to send her away. The shape at the tree line had not frightened her, because it had been still and watchful, in the way that something is still and watchful, when it is not planning to act, when it is simply there. But last night had been different. He had come close. He had woken her. He had walked her to the road. And in the time between those things, she had looked at him clearly, and tried to understand what she was looking at, and the conclusion she had come to, the one she had not voiced, the one she was still turning over this morning between one flower stem and the next, was that this man was not a neighbor checking his property. He was not a hiker. He was not anyone you would encounter in the ordinary course of things. There was something in the way he moved, the way he had arrived out of nowhere in a dark forest without making a single sound, the way he had held himself, completely still for long stretches, with a quality of stillness that was more deliberate than anything ordinary. The way he had looked at her and the feeling it had produced, not fear, not that, but the particular alertness that comes when something in your body recognizes that the situation it is in is not quite inside the range of what it has prepared for. Ethan had had some of that quality too. She had noticed it early, in the first weeks she had known him, before she had any framework for it. There had been moments when he sat very still, in a way that was entirely different from ordinary stillness. Moments when he heard something she could not hear. Moments when he went to the window at 3 in the morning, and stood there, and she had asked him what he was listening for, and he had said nothing, just the wind, and she had believed him, and she had not believed him at the same time. She had chosen not to ask. She had understood, without needing a direct explanation, that there were things Ethan was not yet able to tell her. She had understood the word yet. She had been waiting for the yet to become something else. The yet had become a grave in a hillside forest, and she was standing in a flower shop sorting stems, and the man who had walked her to the road last night knew Ethan Morrow's name. She was certain of that. Certain in the way she was certain of other things that had never been said to her out loud, but that were simply true. Her friend Nora came in at 9, pulling off her coat and dropping her bag on the back shelf, and picking up where the conversation from the previous afternoon had left off, which was her view on the most efficient way to manage the Saturday wedding order. Lyra listened to her and responded in the right places, and kept her hands moving through the work, and her mind continued turning over the same quiet questions. She had told him she was going to come back. She had said it directly, and she had meant it, and it had been important to her to say it, rather than simply disappear, and then reappear the following week without acknowledgement. She did not know why that had mattered. It had simply felt like the honest thing to do, and she had been committed to honesty in that place for a long time now, in the way that you are committed to something when there is no one watching, and no one to be honest with but yourself, and the stone, and the air above it. She finished the morning arrangements, she sorted the delivery, she made Nora tea, and herself coffee, and stood at the back window for a few minutes, looking at the narrow alley behind the shop where 2 pigeons were engaged in some private disagreement over a piece of bread. She thought about the way the man had looked at the grave. She had been watching him carefully from the corner of her eye, when he glanced at the stone marker, and she had seen something in his face that she recognized. Not grief exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that sat just next to grief, the way a shadow sits next to the thing that casts it. Recognition, maybe. The particular look of someone who knows a name, and is encountering it in a context that changes what the name means, She had decided, without knowing why, that this mattered, that whatever connection he had to Ethan's grave was not a simple one. She went back to the flowers and let the morning work carry the rest. Owen returned in the late afternoon. Callum was in the kitchen when he heard the gate, and he went to the door and let Owen in and put the kettle on without asking any questions, which was how he preferred to receive reports. He liked to let the person decide how to begin, because the way someone began told you almost as much as what they said. Owen sat down at the table and waited until the tea was in front of him. Then he said, "Her name is Lyra Hale, 27 years old. She has worked at a flower shop called Seasons in the Lower Market for 4 years. She runs it now, more or less. The original owner hands things to her. She lives in the flat above the shop. She has lived in the town for 6 years, came from the eastern coast, no family in the area that anyone knows of. She is well liked. People speak well of her. The woman at the bakery next door says she is quiet, but not unfriendly, and she has never been in any kind of difficulty." Callum said nothing. He turned his mug in his hands. "She has a friend named Nora who works with her in the shop," Owen continued. "I couldn't get close enough to speak with Nora directly without it becoming obvious, but I was able to listen in the market for a while. What I could hear was ordinary conversation, the wedding order, the flower deliveries, the general business of the shop." He paused. "I also went to the public records office. I told the clerk I was checking a property boundary registration. While I was there, I looked at the residence records. Lyra Hale has been registered at the same address for 6 years. Nothing unusual in the record." "And Ethan?" Callum said. Owen was quiet for a moment. 2 of Ethan's Tuesdays in the town corresponded with days when the records show a license issued for a market stall in the lower district. "Seasonal. I cross-checked the location of the stall with where the flower shop sits." He looked at Callum. "Same street." Callum set his mug down. 3 years, Callum said. "At least," Owen said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the afternoon light was going gray, the particular gray of late autumn that came down over everything, like a lid, and reduced the world to its shapes and its distances. Callum thought about Ethan Morrow, standing in a flower shop on a Tuesday morning. He thought about it in a way that was very specific, with the particular effort of trying to see something you did not witness, and could not reconstruct from memory. Ethan in a market, among flowers, speaking to a woman with green eyes. He tried to imagine the beginning of it, how 2 people who lived in completely different worlds could have found their way to 3 years of a hidden life. "She doesn't know what he was," Owen said. It was not a question. "I don't know what she knows," Callum said carefully. "She knows more than nothing. She came to that burial ground every week for over a year. She knows that land is not ordinary. She has seen me in the trees." He paused. "She was not afraid last night. That is worth noting." Owen considered that. "What do you want to do?" Callum thought for a moment. "Nothing yet," he said. "I want to think." Owen nodded. He finished his tea. He stood up, put his coat back on and said, "The elders will notice eventually, if they haven't already." "I know," Callum said. "They will have a position." "They always have a position," Callum said. "That doesn't mean the position is right." Owen looked at him for a moment, with the careful, steady expression he used when he wanted to say something and was deciding whether to say it. Eventually he said, "She comes every week." "Yes," Callum said. "She has been coming every week for over a year, and nobody stopped her." "No. That means she has had a long time to decide whether she is going to stop," Owen said. "And she clearly has decided she isn't." Callum looked at the table. "I know," he said. Owen picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "I'll be at the house if you need me," he said, and let himself out. Callum sat at the table after he left, and watched the afternoon go gray outside the window, and thought about Ethan Morrow walking down a street in the market district with his hands in his pockets, heading somewhere on a Tuesday morning that nobody in the pack knew about. He thought about the particular discipline that must have taken, the particular discipline of maintaining, for 3 years, a complete separation between 2 entire lives, of being one person here and another person there, and never letting the 2 touch, of loving someone in a world your people could not know about, because you were afraid of what knowing would mean for them. He thought about what that kind of love said about a person. He got up eventually and went back to his desk. The work was waiting. It was always waiting. He picked up the next item in the pile and read it without taking in a single word. and then he put it down, and went to stand at the window and look at the burial ground on the hill in the fading afternoon light. Next Tuesday, he thought, she would come with flowers. He made himself go back to the desk. The next 3 days were not easy. Callum moved through the ordinary business of running the pack, the boundary reports, the maintenance schedules, the long conversation with the grain supplier in the valley, the 2 separate disputes between families in the northern property that needed resolving with enough firmness to be final, and enough sensitivity to leave everyone's dignity intact. He did all of it. He did it with the attention it required and the follow-through it needed, and no one who worked with him during those 3 days would have noticed anything different. Inside, he was working through something that had no clear procedure. On the second day, he went to the records cabinet and took out the formal register that Owen maintained, the one with the official documentation for every pack member, and he sat at his desk with it open in front of him. He found Ethan's entry. He read through the entire thing. Ethan Morrow. Date of birth, the 3rd of March, 31 years ago. Date of entry into the Dre Pack, 9 years prior. Original rank, patrol trainee. Final rank, senior patrol warrior. Record of conduct, no infractions, no formal disputes, no reprimands. Awards of distinction, 2. For separate incidents during the Mountain Territory dispute 4 years ago. Health record, clean. Next of kin, none registered. Mate status, none registered. Callum read that last line 3 times. Mate status, none registered. He thought about what it had taken for Ethan to maintain that line. Not once, in 9 years, had he put a name there. He had come to the pack at 22 years old, and he had filed his registration with every required line filled in, and that particular line blank, and 9 years later when the register was last updated, it had still been blank. He had been disciplined enough, careful enough, and perhaps afraid enough, to keep it blank through 3 years of a relationship that had been serious enough for her to come to his grave every week for over a year. Callum closed the register and put it away. He went for a long walk that evening, not to the burial ground, but through the forest that ran west of the pack's main property. He walked until the light was almost completely gone, and the trees were shapes rather than distinct things, and he stood in the dark with his hands in his coat pockets and let himself think about the North Canyon. It had been a decision made at 3 in the morning. That was the first thing. Not an excuse, simply a fact that he had always considered relevant. The intelligence had arrived at 2:30 with the confirmation that the rival group attempting to push through the pack's eastern territory was moving faster than any of their earlier tracking had suggested. The window for intercepting them at the most defensible point, the narrow pass at the bottom of the North Canyon, was 6 hours at most. After that, the pass would be behind the group, and the ground would work against Callum's unit rather than for them. He had 4 patrol units available. He had weighed each one's capabilities against what the terrain and the number would require. He had spread the map across the table in the command tent and traced the routes with his finger and made the calculations that his training had built him to make, quickly and without sentiment. He had selected the unit and he had given the order, and the unit had moved out by 4 in the morning. They had been led by Ethan Morrow. The mission had succeeded. The rival group had been turned back. The Eastern Territory had held. By mid-morning, Callum had received confirmation that the threat was resolved and the pass was secure. He had received the casualty report 2 hours later. 1 loss. Ethan Morrow, senior patrol warrior, killed during the final push through the canyon's narrowest point. Callum had been standing at the entrance of the command tent when Owen told him. He had been looking across the hillside at the morning. He remembered the quality of the light, very clear and cold and specific, the kind of light that made everything look like it meant something. He remembered the feeling that moved through him when Owen said the name, a heavy, dropping feeling, the kind that came not from surprise but from receiving a truth you had been hoping was not true. He had gone inside the tent. He had sat down. He had taken 10 minutes before he went back out to the rest of the unit. 10 minutes in which he permitted himself the grief in private, before putting it away and going back to the work that the morning still required. He had always believed that was the right way to handle it. The only way to continue leading people through difficult situations was to feel the grief and contain it and not let it spread, because grief that spreads through a command structure at a critical moment costs more lives than the one it is mourning. Standing now in the dark forest west of the property, 3 months and 14 months and a whole year past that morning, he thought about those 10 minutes in the tent and wondered if he had been wrong about what they meant. He had grieved Ethan Morrow in 10 minutes behind a tent flap, and then gone back out and continued the mourning. He had spoken at the October gathering with steadiness. He had overseen the placement of the stone with care and precision. He had made sure the burial ground was properly maintained in the months after. He had told himself that this was what leadership required, and that doing it well was the truest form of respect he could offer. He had not thought, in any of that, about the woman in the flat above the flower shop on the lower Market Street, who had received a sealed letter from a stranger at her door one morning, and had then spent weeks finding a grave she had not been told about. That was what was working through him now in the dark. The specific nature of the gap between how he had understood Ethan Morrow's death and what that death had actually cost. He had known it as a military loss, as a personal loss, as a grief carried in the particular way that leaders carry the grief of the people who follow them. He had not known it as the thing it also was, which was the end of a life that had been fuller than any record in any cabinet showed. He walked back to the house in the dark. On the 4th day after the night in the burial ground, Owen came to him with something he had noticed on his second visit to the town. He had gone back down, he said, to follow up on one detail. He had gone to the small community hall at the edge of the Market District, where the local record office kept a secondary archive. He had asked, again with the cover of a property boundary question, to see the list of commercial licenses for the lower Market Street over the past 4 years. He placed the page he had copied on Callum's desk. "Look at the start date," Owen said. Callum looked. The flower shop, Seasons, had changed its operating license 4 years ago, when the new running arrangement between the owner and Lyra Hale was formalized. And 3.5 years ago, approximately 6 months after Lyra Hale became the shop's primary operator, Ethan Morrow had increased the frequency of his visits to the town, from monthly to weekly. 6 months, Callum said. "Give or take," Owen said. "Long enough to get to know someone. Long enough to be certain." Callum set the page down. He thought about the timeline that was assembling itself from these scattered pieces. Ethan meeting Lyra at some point during a visit to the market, returning more often, with a reason. 3.5 years ago, something becoming more than casual. A decision, not taken lightly, knowing Ethan, to build something real. And then the work of keeping it real, while also keeping it hidden, for 3 full years, until the mission and the canyon and the morning that ended it. "Did you find anyone who remembered them together?" Callum asked. Owen paused. "The woman who runs the bakery next to the flower shop," he said. "I asked her, in general terms, whether she had known anyone from outside the town, who used to come to the market regularly. I described Ethan, without using his name. She thought about it. She said there was a man who used to come on Tuesdays, dark-haired, quiet, always stopped at the flower shop first. She said he and the young woman who ran the shop were clearly close, but they were not showy about it. She said she had always assumed he was a boyfriend, but she had never pressed for details, because it was not her business. She said she hadn't seen him in well over a year." Owen was quiet for a moment. "She said the young woman had seemed different since then. Not unhappy exactly, just quieter." Callum thought about that. Just quieter. "Thank you," he said. Owen nodded and left. Callum sat at his desk for a long time. He was trying to build a full picture of what he was dealing with, and the picture was becoming clearer in a way that made it heavier rather than simpler. This was not an anonymous trespasser with an unclear connection to a grave on Packland. This was a woman who had loved one of his people with enough depth and commitment that she had built her weeks around a grave in a forest, and had kept doing it through all the weather and all the months since October of last year, alone, with no one to sit beside her in the dark. That was not something you accounted for easily. And he was the person who had given the order that put Ethan in the North Canyon. He had not been thinking about that particular connection much since the night in the burial ground, or rather, he had been thinking about it constantly without letting himself look directly at it. It was present in every hour of the past 4 days, in the background of the boundary reports and the family disputes and the work, in the space just behind whatever he was focusing on at any given moment. He had been keeping it there because he was not yet ready to hold it in the front of his mind, where it would require him to do something about it. He thought about the record book with the line that said "no recorded mate." He thought about Owen saying "just quieter." He made himself look at it directly. He had given an order. The order had been the right military decision given everything he knew at the time, and he did not know how to separate that fact from the other fact, which was that the order had taken Ethan Morrow out of a life that was more than a military record. He had told himself for 14 months that the rightness of the decision was what mattered, that all decisions of that kind had costs, and that the cost was not the same as a mistake. He still believed that, in the part of him that had been trained to believe it. But he was beginning to understand that believing something about a decision and fully accounting for what the decision cost were not the same thing at all. He got up. He put his coat on. He walked to the burial ground in the afternoon, not because Tuesday had come yet, but because he needed to stand in front of the stone and look at it without the weight of a sleepless night pressing on everything. He stood there for a long time. The afternoon was cold and clear, and the stone was exactly as it always was, and the last of the dried wildflowers that she had laid there a few days ago were still at its base, pressed flat by the wind but still there. He looked at the name. He let himself look at it without trying to do anything about how it felt. Then he walked home and made himself eat something and went to his desk and did the work that was waiting, and he told himself that he would be at the burial ground on Tuesday before dark. He owed her at least the honesty of being present. He owed Ethan more than he had given him, and he could not give it to Ethan anymore. But Ethan had left someone behind who was still here, who was still coming every week, who was still pressing flowers into the ground with both hands in the dark. He could at least be present for that. He arrived at the burial ground on Tuesday just before dusk. The sky was turning the pale orange of early evening, and the light came through the trees at a low angle that made the stone markers throw long shadows across the grass. He walked to Ethan's grave and stood there. He had not brought anything. He had not thought to, and then when he was halfway through the forest he had thought about it, and then he had decided it was not his place to bring anything. The flowers belonged to her. The visiting was hers. He was here for a different reason, one he had not fully articulated to himself, but that had something to do with not being absent anymore. He heard her coming before she arrived. Her footsteps were familiar to him now from the walk they had taken to the road, and he recognized the particular careful pace she used on the uneven ground. She came around the oak and stopped when she saw him, not in alarm, in the considered pause of someone who has registered an unexpected variable and is taking a moment to process it. He turned toward her. She was wearing a different coat tonight, a heavier one, and she was carrying the flowers in the crook of one arm, rather than in her hand. 3 bunches, he noticed, more than usual. She had brought more than she normally did. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked the rest of the way to the grave, and crouched down, and began to arrange the flowers at the base of the stone, working in her precise, practiced way. He stayed where he was, a few feet back, giving her the room the moment required. When she finished, she stood and looked at the stone for a moment, and then turned slightly and looked at him. "You came early," she said. "I came before dark," he said. "As you asked." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of a small, unexpected thing. "I meant me," she said. "I usually come later. I came early today because—" She stopped. She glanced at the grave and back. "I thought it might be different to see it in the light." He looked at the stone. In the low orange light of the evening, the name was very clear. "Is it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "And yes." They stood side by side in the early evening, with the stone between them, and the grass very green, and the last of the orange light moving through the trees. He had expected it to be awkward, standing here beside someone he did not know, at the grave of a man he had known for 9 years without knowing him well enough. He had expected to have to manage the silence, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had weight in it, but not tension, the kind that 2 people fell into when neither of them needed to fill it. After a while he said, "How did you meet him?" She looked at the grave. She considered whether to answer. He could see her deciding. Not whether to trust him, exactly, but whether she was ready to speak about this here, in this place, with this specific person. He did not rush the decision. Then she said, "I met him in the library." He waited. "There's a library in the town," she said. "In the old part, near the clock tower. I used to go there on rainy days, when the shop was quiet. I would take my lunch, and sit in the reading room by the window, and sometimes I would stay for an hour or 2 in the afternoon." She paused. He came in on a Tuesday. It was raining very hard. He was looking for a specific book, a history of the mountain territories in this region. The old one. The one that's out of print. I happened to know exactly where it was, because I had read it a few months before. She was looking at the stone while she spoke, but her eyes were somewhere further back than the stone itself. I showed him where it was, she said. He asked me how I had known about it. I told him I liked old things and quiet places. He said he did too. We talked for 3 hours in the history section. I was late to close up the shop. I walked out into the rain and realized I had not thought about the shop for 3 hours, which had not happened in a very long time. A brief pause. He came back the next day. Callum looked at the side of her face. She was not smiling, but the memory had softened something in her expression. The tightness around the eyes had eased slightly, replaced by the kind of look that appears when the mind goes back to a time when it did not yet know what it was going to lose. "And the day after that?" he asked. "And the day after that," she said. "And the day after that, for a week, until I finally said yes when he asked me to walk with him by the river." She paused again. "He asked very carefully," she said, like someone who was not entirely certain whether asking was the right thing to do, but had decided to do it anyway, because not asking felt worse. Callum thought about Ethan and believed that completely. "That was 3.5 years ago," she said. The evening was deepening around them, the orange going out of the light, and the first cool blue of dusk coming in to replace it. A bird called from somewhere in the high branches above them, and then went quiet. She had not moved from where she was standing, and neither had he, and the grave was between them, with the new flowers bright against the darkening ground. "He talked about this land," Callum said. He said it carefully, aware that he was offering something. Information about Ethan that she had not asked for, but that might matter to her. She turned her head slightly toward him, listening. Not by name, not specifically, but he talked about the hills and the forest in a way that was particular, Callum said. The way people talk about places that are part of them. He talked about it like someone who belonged to the land rather than just living near it. She was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you," she said. Callum went still. "Not by name," she said quickly. "He never said a name. But he talked about someone, a person he trusted above anyone else. The way you talk about someone who is more than an employer, and more than a friend. Someone you believed in." She looked at the grave. "I think it was the thing he was most proud of, being part of what you built here. Whatever this is." She gestured at the burial ground, at the land, at the space around them. "He never told me what it was exactly, but I could hear it when he talked about it." Callum stood very still and let that land in him. The last of the light went from orange to gray. She crossed her arms against the cold, and he became aware that the temperature had dropped sharply in the last few minutes. "I should go," she said, "before dark." She looked at him. "I said I would." "You did," he said. She looked at the stone once more. "Good night then," she said. It was not clear whether she was saying it to him or to the grave. He suspected both. She turned and walked back through the burial ground, and he listened to her footsteps until he could not hear them anymore. Then he turned back to the stone and stood there in the growing dark. He had known Ethan Morrow for 9 years. Ethan had walked into a library on a rainy Tuesday and talked to a woman for 3 hours and gone back every day for a week and asked her to walk by the river with the careful, slightly uncertain caution of someone who was not sure whether asking was right, but could not stand not asking. And he had spent 3.5 years building something specific and real and hidden, and he had died following an order, and now this woman came every week with wildflowers and stood in the dark and told the stone about her day. Callum stayed until the dark was full. The following Tuesday, she arrived to find him there already, standing a few feet from the stone with his hands in the pockets of his coat and his eyes on the hillside rather than the grave. She had come a little earlier than the week before, but he had come earlier still. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment before he turned, aware of her before she spoke. "You keep coming," she said. It was not an accusation. It was closer to an observation being offered as an invitation. "So do you," he said. She walked the rest of the way to the grave and set down her bag. She had brought flowers again. Different ones this week, some from the shop and some she had picked herself along the road up from the valley. She knelt and replaced the ones from last week with the fresh ones, working with the same quiet efficiency he had observed every time, and then she stood. "What is your name?" she said. He had been waiting for this question. She had not asked it the first night or the second time they had met. She had waited through several weeks of standing in the same place without asking, which told him something about her, that she did not ask things before she was ready to hold the answer. "Callum," he said. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already guessed. "Lyra," she said, though they both knew that he knew. She did not know that he knew, and so she offered it, simply and directly. "I know," he said. A pause. "You looked me up. I wanted to understand the situation," he said, "before I decided what to do about it." She looked at him steadily. "And what are you going to do about it?" "I haven't decided yet," he said honestly. She appeared to accept that. She turned back to the grave, and they stood side by side in the afternoon quiet, and after a while she said, "He told me about the library." Callum looked at her. "After the first time we met there," she said. "He went back later and told them he was looking for the book about mountain territories as a gift. He got them to put it aside for him. He wanted a reason to keep coming back that wasn't just me." She smiled slightly. It was the kind of smile that had pain inside it, but also something genuine. "He was careful. He was always very careful about everything. About not making assumptions. About not moving faster than I was comfortable with." She paused. "I think he was afraid of frightening me off." "Did you know why?" Callum asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Not at first," she said. "In the beginning, I just thought he was a cautious person. A private person. Some people are. You don't push someone like that, because pushing makes them close up, and then you've lost them entirely." She glanced at Callum. "I wasn't willing to lose him, so I waited." "When did you start to understand that it was more than caution?" he asked. She thought about it carefully. The question was not simple, and she treated it with the weight it deserved. "About a year in," she said finally. "There were small things. The way he moved, sometimes. The way he would go very still in a crowded place, and his eyes would change, just slightly, and he would come back to me a second later, and I would see him making the conscious decision to look like someone who had not been doing whatever he had just been doing. The way he heard things I couldn't hear. The way he came back from what he called work trips, looking like someone who had been through something serious, something more than the ordinary kind of work." She paused. "I never said anything directly. I waited for him to say it." "And he didn't," Callum said. "He was going to," she said. It came out quietly but with certainty. "I know he was going to. The last few months before October, he had been working toward something. I could feel it. He was working toward a conversation. There were moments when he would start to say something and then stop. Once, in the spring, he said, 'There is something I have been wanting to tell you for a long time,' and then his phone went, and he had to go, and when he came back 3 days later, he didn't pick it up again. I knew he would, eventually. I was waiting." She said it without blame, without the particular bitterness that might have gathered in someone less careful about where they placed it. She said it as a simple fact about something that had been true, and had then stopped being true before the waiting finished. They were quiet for a few minutes. The afternoon was cold but not sharply so, and the sky above the trees was a pale, clear gray that softened everything it fell on. "He was going to petition the pack," Callum said. He had not intended to say it. The words came out before the decision to say them had fully formed, and he had no way to pull them back, and after a moment, he did not want to. She deserved whatever pieces of Ethan she had not yet been given. She turned and looked at him directly. "What does that mean?" He thought about how much to say. He thought about the record books and the formal registers and the specific legal mechanism inside pack law that allowed a member to petition for a human companion to be recognized. He thought about whether this was the right moment for that level of information, when she still did not fully know what the pack was. "There were things he wanted to make official," Callum said carefully. "Between the two of you, he was working toward making it formal, making it something that couldn't be questioned." She held his gaze for a moment. "He wanted me to be safe," she said. "He used to say it. Not every time, but often enough that I understood it was one of his organizing concerns. Keeping me safe. Keeping me out of anything that might complicate things for me." She looked at the grave. "I used to think it meant something small, like he was worried about car accidents or bad neighborhoods. I understand now that it meant something much bigger." "It did," Callum said. "And he never told me what specifically, because telling me would have complicated it." "Yes." She pressed her lips together for a moment. Not with anger, with the particular kind of acceptance that comes when you have already done the work of understanding something, and hearing it confirmed is simply the last step. He was protecting me, she said. Up until the very end. He was, Callum said. She turned back to look at the stone. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the light began to shift from afternoon to the early warmth of pre-dusk. A wind came through the trees and moved her hair, and she reached up and held it back from her face for a moment. He used to bring me books, she said, from the library, and from his own collection. He would bring them without any announcement, just set them on the kitchen counter, while I was making tea or looking out the window. I would turn around and there would be a book there. He had very specific taste. He liked history, and he liked books about places. But occasionally he would bring something entirely different. A novel, once, about two people who spent 30 years missing each other by small amounts. He handed it to me and said, "Don't let this happen to us," and I laughed, because I thought he was being dramatic, and now, I think he meant it much more specifically than I understood at the time. Callum looked at the side of her face. He was not a dramatic person, he said. No, she agreed. He really wasn't. He was the most straightforward person I have ever known. He said exactly what he meant, or he said nothing. There was no space in him for things that weren't true. She paused, which meant the things he couldn't say were very loud in their silence. Callum thought about that for a moment. He thought about Ethan in 9 years of meetings and missions, and the ordinary daily work of the pack, and he tried to reconcile the soldier he had known with the man this woman was describing, the one who brought books without announcement and said, "Don't let this happen to us," and had spent 3 years building a hidden life, with enough care and discipline to keep it hidden from everyone. They were the same person, he was sure of that. They were not two different Ethans, they were the same Ethan, seen from two different angles, and the fact that Callum had only ever seen one angle was a gap he was beginning to understand the size of. What was he like at the end? Lyra said. She asked it without looking at him, which told him she had been carrying the question for a while before deciding to put it out loud. Of the last mission? Callum said. No, she said. Before it. In the months before. Was he? She stopped. She was choosing words carefully. Was he well? He was, Callum said. And then, because she deserved the fuller answer, he was more focused than usual, more purposeful. He had the quality of someone who has decided what they are working toward and is moving consistently in that direction. I noted it. I attributed it to professional ambition, or to whatever the current mission demands produced in him. He paused. I understand it differently now. She nodded slowly. He was working toward the conversation, she said. I believe so. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at the stone with an expression that was very still, very clear, and very quiet. I wish he had made it, she said, to the conversation. I would have been ready. I was ready for a long time. Callum looked at the name on the stone. He was aware, standing beside her, that the weight he was carrying had changed its shape slightly. It was the same weight it had been for 14 months, the same facts, and the same grief, and the same accountability. But the shape of it had changed, because now he was holding it alongside someone else, who was holding a different part of it, and the two parts together made something more complete, and also more heavy, than either one had been alone. He stood beside her until she said she needed to go, and then he stayed after she left, in the growing dark, with his hands in his pockets, and the weight settling into a new shape around him. He thought about the conversation Ethan had been working toward, and had not reached. He thought about what it would mean to finish what Ethan had started. He did not know yet what he was going to do, but something in him had moved past the stage of only receiving information, and had begun, quietly and without announcement, to move toward action. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them had broken. Callum came on Tuesdays before dusk, so did Lyra. They had stopped explaining their presence to each other, which was its own kind of explanation. On the second Tuesday, she told him about the early days in the flat above the shop. She and Ethan had spent most of their time there, she said. He had always come to her rather than the other way around, which she had understood was partly because her space was simpler. 2 rooms above a shop, small enough that there was nothing complicated about it, nothing that required navigating or explaining. He would arrive in the late afternoon, and they would cook or go to the market together, and come back and sit in the kitchen, with the window open, even in winter, because he preferred the cold air, and she had learned to like it. They would talk for hours. He was a thoughtful talker, the kind who listened more than he spoke, who waited until he had something particular to say before he said it, and who, when he did speak, gave you the sense that he had been considering the subject for longer than the conversation. She told Callum this, standing at the side of the grave, with her arms crossed against the November cold, looking at the stone, and Callum listened to it, the way he listened to everything about Ethan now, with the specific attention of someone who is trying to build a complete picture, from pieces that have been scattered across two separate lives. He liked cooking, she said. That surprised me at first. He didn't look like someone who would be interested in that kind of careful, slow thing. He looked like someone who ate quickly, and practically, and didn't give much thought to it, but he was very good at it. He took it seriously. He would taste something, and then stand there thinking, and then go and change one thing and taste it again. He did the same thing with plans, Callum said. He had a habit of going silent after being briefed on a mission, and then coming back an hour later with one specific adjustment. It was always the right adjustment. She glanced at him. There was something in her expression, the particular look of someone receiving an additional piece of information about a person they love, and recognizing it as true, as fitting, as completing something that was already familiar. He didn't waste effort, she said. No, Callum said. He never did. He used that energy on the things he chose, she said. The cooking, the books, the walking by the river. She paused. Me, I suppose. When he chose something, he gave it everything. They stood quietly after that for a few minutes. A light rain had started, barely more than a mist, and it moved through the trees softly, and settled on the stone, and on the grass around the flowers she had brought. I think about the library, she said eventually. I think about it often. The way he came back every day for a week, the way he was so careful about asking, the particular way he asked. He said, I would like to walk by the river with you, if you are willing. Not do you want to, not maybe we should, if you are willing. She looked at the rain moving across the stone. I said yes immediately. I almost said yes before he finished the sentence. Why didn't you? Callum asked. She considered. Because he had asked so carefully, she said, and the careful asking deserved a careful answer, not a hurried one. Callum stood in the light rain and thought about that. He thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone with that level of care, to have someone look at you and decide you were worth the risk of a very careful question, and then to have them return every day for a week so that you would know they meant it. He thought about what it was like to be on the receiving end of that, and he thought about what it cost the person doing it, what kind of certainty you had to have built, inside yourself, before you could ask something carefully enough that the person you were asking felt the weight of it. He was beginning to understand that Ethan Morrow had been a man of very specific depths, and that those depths had been, for Callum, entirely invisible. He was not sure what to do with that. He was sure of one thing, standing in the light rain beside Lyra Hale, with the stone between them and the mist settling on everything quietly. Whatever came next needed to be done with the same quality of care that Ethan had put into a Tuesday afternoon question in a library. He owed them both at least that much. She brought the letter on a Tuesday in December. She did not bring it intentionally, or rather she had been carrying it for 14 months in the inner pocket of whichever coat she wore, in an envelope that had been opened and refolded, and held in her hands so many times that the paper had softened to the texture of cloth. She was not certain why she kept it with her everywhere. She thought it might be because having it somewhere separate, in a drawer, in a box, somewhere stationary and fixed, felt like a kind of distance she was not willing to put between them, so it traveled with her. To work, to the market, to the library on quiet afternoons, and to this hillside every Tuesday without exception. On this particular Tuesday, when she arrived at the grave and found Callum already there, she reached into her pocket automatically, the way you reach for something you have been carrying without thinking, and her fingers found the envelope, and she stopped. He noticed. He noticed the way he noticed most things, without drawing attention to it, without asking immediately. He gave her the space of a few minutes first, during which she arranged the new flowers at the base of the stone, and stood back to look at them. Then she said, "He wrote me a letter." "Before the mission?" Callum said. "Before he left," she said. "Yes. I didn't know about it. He had given it to someone. I don't know who. I never found out who. And they were instructed to bring it to me, if he did not come back within a certain number of days." She was still looking at the stone. A man came to my door one morning in November. I had been worried for weeks, because Ethan had stopped coming, and he had not sent any word, and I knew something was wrong, because he had never simply stopped without telling me. This man knocked on my door. He was polite. He said he had something for me from a friend. He handed me the envelope and he left before I could ask him anything. She took the envelope from her pocket and held it for a moment, looking at it. Then she held it out toward Callum. He looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. "You don't have to show me," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." He took the envelope. The paper was worn, as she had said, soft from handling. It had been sealed with plain wax, now broken, and on the front, in Ethan's handwriting, a handwriting Callum recognized from 9 years of mission reports and unit paperwork, was Lyra's name. Nothing else, just her name. Callum opened the envelope carefully. There were 2 pages, both covered front and back with the same handwriting. He read in silence. The letter began with an apology for the method of delivery. It said that he had not wanted to prepare for this possibility while he was still with her, because preparing for it would have required explaining things he was not yet able to explain, and he had been running out of excuses to keep the explanation 1 week further away. He said that by the time she read this, he would have been gone long enough for it to be a certain thing rather than a possible one, and he was sorry for the particular cruelty of that kind of certainty. He wrote about the library. He wrote about going back every day for a week, which he said he had done, not because he was certain she liked him. He was not certain of that at all, but because going back felt like the only honest thing he was capable of at that particular time. He wrote that she had been the first person in his adult life whom he had wanted to be fully honest with, and that wanting that, and not yet being able to achieve it, was the thing he had been living with and working toward for 3 years. He wrote about what he was. Not in detail. The letter was not the place for detail, he said, because detail required conversation and response, and time, none of which the letter could provide. He wrote enough. He wrote that there were things about him, and about the world he was part of, that were outside ordinary experience, and that those things had been both the reason he loved her, and the reason he had been afraid of what loving her meant for her safety, and that those 2 facts had been in tension, inside him, from very close to the beginning. He wrote that she was the most important thing he had ever protected, and he was sorry that protecting her had required keeping her in a kind of darkness for longer than was fair to her. He wrote that he had been working toward the light. He believed he had been close. Near the end, the letter said, "If you can find the grave, go there. It is a good place. The people there are good people, even when the situation makes them seem otherwise. I want you to be able to go there. I want you to be somewhere that was mine, because you were mine, and I do not want those 2 parts of my life to have been entirely separate forever." Callum stopped reading. He held the letter for a moment without folding it back. He was aware that he had gone very still. He was aware that something in him was responding to those words, with a heaviness that he could feel physically, as a specific pressure, somewhere behind his sternum, and he gave himself a moment to simply hold that, before he did anything about it. Go there. The people there are good people. He had trusted Ethan completely in 9 years of shared work. He understood now that Ethan had extended the same trust outward, even past his own death, had written it into a letter, and put it in an envelope and asked it to travel to this woman after he was gone, so that she would have a direction, when direction was the only thing that grief left room for. He folded the letter carefully, and replaced it in the envelope, and handed it back to Lyra. She took it, and put it back in her pocket. She was watching him. "He wrote about what he was," she said. "I know," Callum said. "I read it." "So you know that I know," she said. "Or at least, that I have been given enough to understand the shape of it." "Yes," he said. She nodded. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly." "All right," he said. "Did he tell anyone? Anyone in this world of yours, did he tell anyone about me, before?" Callum looked at her. "No," he said. "As far as I can determine, no one in the pack knew about you until the night I found you here." She absorbed that. "He was going to," she said. "I believe he was working toward it," Callum said. "The petition you mentioned," she said. It was not quite a question. He hesitated. He had said that word a few weeks ago, and left it where it fell. He had not been ready to explain it, and she had not pushed. Now she was pushing, gently, but clearly, and he owed her the answer. There is a formal process, he said carefully, within the pack, for a member to bring someone from outside into the pack's recognition, to make that person's place here official, documented. He paused. Ethan was working toward initiating that process. I believe that is what the conversation was that he had been working toward. She was very quiet. Her eyes were on the stone. She was processing the specific quality of information he had just given her. Not that Ethan had loved her, she knew that. Not that he had wanted her in his life, she knew that too. But that he had taken a specific and formal step toward making that want into a documented, unquestionable fact. That he had moved to give her a standing that could not be removed. He was going to make it so that no one could tell me to leave, she said. Yes, Callum said. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry. He could see her not doing it, holding the feeling in with the particular discipline of someone who has learned to hold feelings in, out of necessity, rather than out of distance from them. She held it, and then she let out a long, slow breath, and she said, he would have done it. I have no doubt, Callum said. He was thorough, she said. When he decided on something, he saw it all the way through. She looked at the stone. He just didn't have enough time. They stood in silence for a few minutes. The December cold was sharp today, the kind of cold that moved into your coat rather than staying outside it, and she had her arms crossed tightly, and her face turned slightly away from the wind. How did you find the grave? He asked. He had wanted to ask this for several weeks. He had waited until it felt right to ask. She was quiet for a moment. The letter told me to come here, she said. It didn't tell me where here was specifically, but it told me enough. The hills, the forest, the burial ground for his people. I went to the town records office, and I looked for anything about a burial ground, or a private cemetery, in the hill forests east of the town. There was a very old entry in the surveyor's register. A parcel of land registered to a family name. Dre. She glanced at him. I walked the roads until I found the path. That took time, he said. 4 weeks, she said. I came every weekend until I found it. And then I found it, and I walked in, and I walked through the older graves, and I came down the slope, and there it was. She looked at the stone. There he was. She paused. I sat down, and I didn't get up for a very long time. Callum looked at the name on the stone. He thought about her walking the roads on 4 consecutive weekends, alone, looking for a path into a forest that was not on any current map. He thought about her coming down the slope and finding the stone. He thought about the particular quality of that moment, the simultaneous arrival of the thing you have been looking for, and the confirmation of the thing you were already sure of. He wanted you to be able to come here, Callum said. It felt important to say it directly. He wrote it. He asked you to come here because he wanted this place, and you to not be entirely separate. He wanted that specific thing. She looked at him. Her eyes were clear and steady, and the particular kind of red that eyes went when they had been close to tears without giving in to them. I know, she said. That is why I come. She looked back at the stone. I come because he asked me to. Callum stood beside her in the cold December afternoon and said nothing for a while. There was nothing to say that would add to what she had just said. It was already complete. He stood with her until the light began to go, and then they walked to the road together without planning it, and at the road they stopped, and she looked at him and said, "Thank you, Callum." He did not ask what she was thanking him for. He was fairly certain he knew. He watched her walk up the road until the dark took her, and then he walked back into the forest and stood at the grave alone for a while. He thought about the line in the letter. The people there are good people, even when the situation makes them seem otherwise. He thought about what that meant coming from Ethan. A man who did not say things carelessly. A man who weighed what he said. A man who had written that specific sentence knowing he would not be there when Lyra read it. Knowing that the first time she encountered the people he had belonged to might be confusing, or difficult, or something she could not immediately understand. Good people, even when the situation makes them seem otherwise. He thought about the elders. He thought about what was coming. He had known for several weeks that Elder Marcus had noticed the situation, and was forming a response to it. He could feel it in the air of the pack, in the particular way that information moved through the community, when someone influential was building toward a formal position. He had been pretending not to notice it. He could not pretend much longer. He looked at the grave in the dark. "I'll take care of it," he said, quietly, to the stone. as well as I can." He meant it. He arrived at his house the following morning to find something on the porch. Not a person. A folded note, tucked under the corner of the doorstep lantern, in the particular style that Elder Marcus used for communications he considered too important for a messenger, and too sensitive for the usual channels. The note said, "A matter of pack concern requires your attention at your earliest convenience. Elder Marcus would appreciate a meeting within the week." Callum read the note twice, and then put it in his coat pocket and went inside. He had been Alpha King for 11 years. In that time, he had navigated the Elder Council through 4 separate situations, in which the traditional law of the pack had come into friction with circumstances the law had not anticipated. He was skilled at it. He knew how to hold his position without making it a fight, how to give the elders the respect their function deserved, while also making it clear that his authority was not subordinate to their preferences. He was firm with them. He was patient with them. He had, on 3 of the 4 previous occasions, managed to bring them to a position they could accept without anyone losing face. The 4th occasion, which had been about the rights of pack members who had entered legal disputes with neighboring families, had been harder. Marcus in particular had held his position for several weeks past the point where it was productive. Eventually, the matter had been resolved, but not before a month of the kind of tension that made the whole pack quieter and more careful with each other. He thought about that month now. He thought about what Marcus would say when he came to him with this new situation. He thought about the arguments Marcus would use, which would be traditional and principled and not entirely wrong, from within the framework they came from. He thought about what he would say in return. He put the kettle on. He thought about the letter, about the line that said the people there are good people. He believed he was a good person. He believed most of the pack were good people. He believed Marcus was, in his own way, a good person who cared about the traditions he was upholding. He also believed that good people were capable of building walls around their goodness that made it impossible for the right thing to get in. He drank his tea. He thought about Lyra standing at the grave with the letter in her pocket, worn to cloth from a year of carrying. He thought about everything Ethan had tried to build and what it had cost him to try to build it, and what it would mean if the wall held even now, after everything. He wrote a short reply to Marcus, arranging a meeting for the following Monday. Then he went back to his desk and did the work that was waiting, and he let the problem of the elders sit in the background of his mind for the rest of the week, turning it over slowly and carefully, the way he had learned to turn over problems that required patience and precision, and the particular kind of steadiness that could not be rushed into being, but had to be arrived at honestly. He arrived at it by Sunday evening. He was ready. Elder Marcus arrived on Monday morning, with the other 2 members of the Elder Council, Grace, the eldest of the 3, who was 70 years old, and moved with the particular precision of someone who had decided long ago that no motion would be wasted, and Peter, who was the youngest of the 3 at 58, and who almost always spoke last, when Marcus and Grace had said what they intended, and it was time for the 3rd position to close the space between them. Callum let them in. He brought tea. He sat at the head of the table and gave them time to settle and arrange themselves, because that was the correct way to begin a difficult conversation, with enough patience at the start that no one felt rushed, and no one entered the substance of the discussion still carrying the friction of the approach. Marcus began. He was formal about it, which was his way. He laid out the situation as he saw it in the same organized manner he brought to every council discussion. The facts first, then the concern, then the position. The facts were these. A human woman had been entering the burial ground on a weekly basis for an extended period. She had been observed on multiple occasions. She was not family to any pack member, not registered, not recognized in any formal or informal capacity. The burial ground was sacred pack land. Its sanctity was enshrined in the founding laws that predated Callum's tenure as Alpha King, and predated the tenure of every Alpha King before him going back 5 generations. The concern was straightforward. If a human woman was permitted to use the burial ground without formal standing, the precedent created would weaken the protections around sacred land that the pack had maintained for over 2 centuries. These protections existed not as arbitrary tradition but as practical safeguards. They kept the pack's private matters private. They ensured that the most vulnerable and significant land, the resting place of the dead, was not accessible to people who did not understand what they were in. The position of the Elder Council was that the woman should be formally informed that her presence was not permitted, and that if she continued to enter the land, the appropriate next steps under pack law should be initiated. Marcus finished, and sat back in his chair, and looked at Callum with the measured expression of a man who has delivered an argument he believes is sound, and is now waiting to see whether the person across the table agrees. Callum looked at all three of them in turn. Grace was holding her tea in both hands, watching him with the calm attention she brought to everything. Peter was looking at the table. "I hear you," Callum said. Marcus inclined his head slightly. "The argument you have made is a reasonable one within the framework it comes from," Callum said. "I'm not going to dismiss it. The founding protections around the burial ground are real, and they exist for real reasons, and I take those reasons seriously." He paused. "I'm also going to tell you some things that I don't believe you currently know, and I ask that you hear them before you consider the matter settled." Marcus straightened slightly. It was not resistance, exactly. It was the adjustment that came when someone had prepared for one kind of conversation and found themselves entering a different one. Callum told them about Ethan. Not everything, not the letter, not the full depth of what Lyra had told him over the past weeks, but enough. He told them that the woman who was coming to the burial ground was the person Ethan Morrow had been with for 3 years before his death. He told them that Ethan had kept this from the pack out of a specific fear for her safety, a fear that now, in this room, with this conversation happening, had turned out to be not entirely without foundation. He told them that she had found the grave herself, after weeks of searching, because Ethan had left her a letter asking her to find it, and he told them that she came every week because a man who had loved her for 3 years had asked her to be there. The room was quiet when he finished. Grace spoke first. "If what you are describing is accurate," she said carefully, "then the woman had a genuine connection to one of our people." "She did," Callum said. "She does. The connection does not end because Ethan is gone. The law," Marcus said, "does not recognize informal connections." "The law was written to protect the pack from strangers," Callum said. "She is not a stranger. She loved a member of this pack for 3 years, and she has been mourning him on his own ground for 14 months. The law was not written to handle this situation." Marcus looked at him steadily. "With respect," he said, "the law was written to handle exactly this situation. A human with no formal standing on pack land. The question of whether the connection was genuine is the entire question," Callum said. "It is not secondary. It is the center of it." There was a pause. "What are you proposing?" Peter said. It was the first time he had spoken. "I'm not ready to propose anything today," Callum said. "I'm telling you that I am aware of the situation, and that I am considering it carefully, and that the decision will be made by me in due time. I am also telling you that any action against this woman before that decision is made will be considered an action against my judgment, and I will respond accordingly." The words were clear, and even, and without anger, which was precisely how he had intended to say them. He was not warning them, he was informing them. He was drawing the boundary exactly where it needed to be, and doing it in the way that left no room for misunderstanding. Marcus held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. The meeting ended. On Friday, Lyra went to the market. It was a routine errand. She needed supplies for the wedding order that was finally coming to completion, some specialty ribbon from the stall on the east side of the market, a few specific items from the dry goods vendor. She went on her lunch break, which she often did when the shop was quiet in the middle of the day, carrying her basket and her list, and moving through the familiar space with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was. She was in the flower supply aisle when they approached her. There were 2 of them. The one who spoke first was large, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cut close, and a quality about him that she had learned to notice over the past year. The particular quality that was also present in the man from the burial ground and had been present in Ethan, a kind of stillness and density that was slightly outside the range of ordinary. His name was Felix, though she did not know this. The other one stood slightly behind him with his arms crossed and did not speak. "You're the woman who goes to the forest on Tuesdays," Felix said. He said it pleasantly, which was the part that made it cold. Lyra looked at him. "I am," she said. "We wanted to speak with you about that," he said, "as a courtesy, before it becomes something more formal." She put down the ribbon she was holding. She gave him her full attention, because she had found over the years that giving people her full attention when they were trying to make her uncomfortable was the most effective way to establish that she was not going to be made uncomfortable. "All right," she said. "What would you like to say?" Felix laid it out with the same pleasant tone throughout, which was its own kind of pressure. He said that the forest she was entering was private land, belonging to a community he was part of. He said that community had specific laws about who was and was not permitted to use that land. He said she was not permitted. He said he was raising this with her now, informally and as a courtesy, because it was cleaner than the alternative, which would involve a formal process that she would not enjoy and that would not go in her favor. He asked her if she understood. Lyra stood in the market aisle with the smell of the flower supply stall all around her and looked at Felix for a moment. "I understand what you have said," she said. "I want you to know that I am going to continue coming to the forest on Tuesdays." She said it the same way she had said it to Callum on the road that first night, simply, as a statement of fact. "What you decide to do about that is your decision, but I want to be honest with you about mine." Felix looked at her. He had expected, she thought, a more frightened response. The pleasantness of his tone had relied on the expectation of fear. "I would reconsider," he said, "for your own sake." "Thank you," she said. She picked up the ribbon and put it in her basket. "I'll keep that in mind." She finished her shopping. She walked back to the shop at a steady pace, went upstairs to the flat, and stood in the kitchen for several minutes. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the kitchen counter and breathed through it. She was not afraid of Felix. She was not going to let the conversation change what she did on Tuesdays, but her hands were shaking, and she let them shake for a few minutes before she went back down to the shop and picked up the work that was waiting. She did not tell Nora. She thought about telling Callum. She decided she would wait and see. She came on Tuesday with the flowers and did not mention it, which meant she had decided to wait longer than a week. He could tell something had happened by a quality in her silence that was slightly different from the usual quality. The usual silence was settled, the particular kind that belonged to someone at rest in a familiar place. Tonight, it had a carefully maintained quality, as though she had constructed it deliberately, rather than simply fallen into it. He did not press. They stood at the grave for nearly an hour that evening, talking about smaller things. A book she had been reading, a detail of the flower shop's Saturday arrangement that had not come out the way she intended, a memory she had of Ethan burning eggs on a Tuesday morning and refusing to admit it was intentional, even when the evidence was clear. She laughed at the egg story, a short, genuine sound that disappeared quickly into the winter dark, and he found himself smiling at the side of her face without quite intending to. She left at the usual time. He stayed. He thought about the maintained quality of her silence. He thought about Felix. He had known, when he left the Monday meeting with the elders, that some version of this might happen. Marcus had accepted the boundary Callum had drawn, but that acceptance applied to Marcus himself. It did not necessarily apply to every other member of the pack who was aware of the situation, and not all of them had the elders' discipline for working through formal channels. Felix was the kind of man who operated in the space between the formal and the informal, who understood that there were some messages that were most effective when they arrived without any official record attached to them. Callum had underestimated the speed. He would not underestimate it again. He went home and sent a short message to Owen. He needed a quiet account of what had happened in the town market on Friday. He needed it without anyone knowing he was asking. Owen was the right person for both requirements. Owen came back to him by morning. He stood at the kitchen table while Owen told him, briefly, without editorializing, because Owen never editorialized, what had been observed by Clara, who had been at the market for her own reasons, and had seen the encounter from across the stall. She held her ground, Owen said. Clara said she was steady, completely steady. Of course she was, Callum said. Owen looked at him. Felix and Leon? Callum said. Felix spoke, Owen said. Leon was there for presence. I see, Callum said. He was quiet for a moment. Get a message to Felix, he said, not through the Elder Council, directly. Tell him that the situation on the market street is closed. Tell him that if I hear of any further contact with that woman, the conversation he and I have next will be formal, and he will not find it pleasant. Make sure he understands that this is not a preference. It is a direction. Owen nodded. And the elders? I'll handle the elders, Callum said, in the right order. The right order mattered. He had learned that long ago. When multiple problems arrived in close succession, the sequence in which you addressed them determined how much friction each one produced. You did not take the most visible problem first, if the most visible problem was the last piece of a structure that had to be handled from the foundation up. The foundation here was Lyra, her standing, her formal place in a situation that currently had no formal framework for her. He needed to create one. He sat at his desk after Owen left and thought about the petition process, which he had been thinking about at intervals for several weeks without yet doing anything about. The formal process required initiating a review, which required a petitioner, which in the usual order of things was a pack member, advocating on behalf of an outsider. With Ethan gone, there was no obvious petitioner. There was, however, the Alpha King. He had used his authority before to initiate processes that did not have an obvious petitioner. It was within his power. It was not usual, but pack law did not prohibit it. He would need to be precise and careful about how he framed it. He would need to anticipate Marcus's objections and prepare the answers to them before the conversation, rather than during it. He spent the morning drafting notes. He was not finished by the time the afternoon came, and he was not finished by evening. He worked on it for 3 days, which was longer than he usually spent preparing for any conversation. But this was not any conversation. This was the conversation that would determine what happened to a woman who came every Tuesday with wildflowers, because a man she loved had asked her to, and he was not going to walk into it with anything less than complete preparation. On the 4th day, he put the notes away. He knew what he was going to say. He did not need to rehearse it anymore. He needed to go to the town. He went on a Thursday morning, early enough that the market had not yet fully opened, but late enough that the flower shop would be unlocked. He parked at the edge of the lower district and walked the rest of the way on foot, which was how he preferred to approach the town. Walking gave him time to read the street, to understand what it held on any given morning, to arrive at his destination with a full picture, rather than the partial one that came from arriving quickly. The shop was open. Through the glass of the front window he could see Lyra at the back table, her hands moving through a large order of stems, her attention focused downward. She had not heard him approach. He knocked twice on the glass before opening the door. She looked up. Something crossed her face, quick and hard to read. Surprise, and beneath that, something else. Relief, possibly. The particular kind of relief that comes when you were not expecting someone to come and then they come. "Callum," she said. "I know about Friday," he said. He said it immediately, because she deserved to know that she had not been alone in it, and because saying it quickly was kinder than arriving at it slowly. She set down the stems in her hands and looked at him. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Clara." "Yes," he said. She looked at the table. "I wasn't going to stop coming," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you weren't." He paused. "Felix and Leon will not approach you again. I have taken care of that." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he had the sensation, familiar now from their Tuesdays together, of being looked at by someone who was seeing past the surface of a thing and into the actual substance of it. She had a quality of attention that was very complete and very unrushed. It had made him slightly uncomfortable in the early weeks. Now it felt simply like what it was. "Thank you," she said. "There are things I need to tell you," he said. "Not here. Is there somewhere we can walk?" She took off her apron and told Nora she would be back in an hour. Nora looked at Callum with the particular expression of someone who notices that an unusual person has arrived for their colleague and is deciding whether to comment. She decided not to, which Callum appreciated. They walked to the small park at the edge of the lower market district. 2 benches, a line of bare winter trees, a path that ran alongside a narrow stream. It was quiet at this hour, a Thursday late morning, with most of the town at work and the market still setting up. They sat on one of the benches, and she pulled her coat together and waited. He told her what he needed to tell her. He told her about the elder council meeting, about Marcus's formal presentation, about the argument the elders had made. He told her that he had drawn a line in that meeting, and that the line had held with the elders themselves, but that not everyone in the pack was the elder council. He told her about Felix, and about the direction he had given to ensure it would not happen again. He told her that there was a formal process underway, not yet complete, not yet finalized, to establish her standing with the pack in a way that could not be challenged by anyone, including Marcus. She listened to all of it without interrupting. She had always listened this way, completely, with the full quality of her attention, not waiting for her turn to speak, but genuinely receiving what was being said. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" she said. She did not say it with suspicion. She said it with the honest desire to understand. He looked at the bare trees along the stream. Because it is the right thing to do, he said. Because Ethan wanted it. Because you have spent 14 months on this alone, and you should not have to spend the rest of it that way. She considered that. Those are all reasons that are about other things, she said. About Ethan, and about Wright, and about the past. I'm asking about you. He looked at her. She was watching him with the clear eyes he had come to recognize and to trust. She was not asking him to be more than he was. She was asking him to be honest about what he was, which was a different and much simpler request. I feel responsible, he said, for the situation as a whole, for the part I played in it, which I have not yet fully told you about. And I find that, he stopped, he started again. I find that I want you to be all right, for reasons that are not entirely about Ethan anymore. She received that. She looked at the stream for a moment. She did not seem alarmed by what he had said. She seemed to be turning it over carefully, placing it next to the other pieces of information she had accumulated, seeing where it fit. Tell me about the part you played, she said. Not today, he said. I will. I promise you I will. But I need to get the formal situation in order first. I don't want to give you that information while the situation around you is still unsettled. I want you to have solid ground to stand on when I tell you. She looked at him for a moment. Is it very bad? She said. It is honest, he said. What it is. She nodded slowly. I can wait, she said. I've learned to wait. They sat beside the stream in the December morning for a while without speaking. A small bird came to the edge of the water and looked at them, and then lost interest and flew away. The market sounds came from the distance, the particular combination of voices and carts, and the sound of the stalls being assembled, that was the texture of a Thursday morning in this town. She said, Can I tell you something? Yes, he said. I think about the future sometimes, she said. I couldn't for a long time. For the first several months, the future felt like a direction I was no longer allowed to face. I could only look at the past or the present. Anything forward was too much. She was looking at the water. But in the past few months, I've been able to face it again a little. I don't know exactly what I am looking at, but I can look. That's not a small thing, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked at the side of her face. He had learned it well over the past months. The particular way she held herself when she was speaking about something she had been thinking about for a while. The slight change in her voice, when the thing she was saying was something she had not said to anyone else before. Ethan. He was very specific about plans. He didn't talk about the future loosely, the way some people do. Someday we should, maybe next year we'll. When he talked about the future, he was specific. He had chosen a direction, and he was describing it. She paused. He talked about a house. Not large. He didn't want large. He wanted something on the edge of something. The edge of a town, or the edge of the forest. Somewhere that was between things. With a garden. He was very clear about the garden. He mentioned gardens in the PAC's property discussions, Callum said. He had opinions about where things should be planted. She smiled slightly. Yes, he did. He thought about growing things very seriously. She paused. He wanted children, she said. Eventually. He talked about it once, and only once, and very carefully. He watched my face while he talked about it. I think he was worried I would say no. I didn't say no. Callum looked at the stream. He was going to make it real, she said. The house, the garden, the formal standing, all of it. He had the whole shape of it in his head. He had thought it through in that particular way of his, where you could hear that it had been considered for a long time, and tested against every possible difficulty, and arrived at from the patient direction, rather than the excited one. She was quiet for a moment. I keep that shape in my head now. Even though the person who made it is gone, the shape of what he intended is still there, and I don't know what to do with it exactly. But I'm not willing to let it dissolve. Callum sat very still. He thought about all the things he had not known about Ethan Morrow, and all the things he was learning now from the woman who had known the rest. He thought about a man who had plans for a house on the edge of things, and a garden, and a future that was specific and concrete and carefully considered, and who had died in a canyon before any of it could happen. He thought about the order he had given. He thought about the fact that he had not yet told her. He made himself sit with the discomfort of that without letting it take over the moment. The moment was hers. She was telling him about a shape she was keeping in her head and refusing to let dissolve, and that deserved his full presence. He was right to keep the shape, Callum said eventually. That kind of thing doesn't have to dissolve just because the person who made it is gone. It can exist differently, but it can still exist. She looked at him. Do you believe that? She said. I'm beginning to, he said. The December morning moved quietly around them. Somewhere in the market, someone was arguing cheerfully about the price of something, the voice rising and then laughing. The stream made its small, constant sound. The bench was cold, and she shifted slightly closer to the center of it without appearing to notice she had done so. They sat there for much longer than the hour she had promised Nora. She sent a short message to the shop at some point, and he heard the shop send something back. They stayed until the morning had fully become the afternoon, talking about smaller things and some larger things, and at no point in the conversation did either of them feel the need to account for the time they were spending or to justify it. When she got up to go, she looked at him for a moment and said, Tuesday? Tuesday, he said. She walked back toward the shop. He stayed on the bench for a while after she left, watching the stream. He thought about the formal process. He thought about the conversation with Marcus that was coming. He thought about what it would mean to get it right, not just adequate, not just defensible, but actually right in the way that Ethan had been working toward before the canyon took him. He was going to get it right. He walked back to his vehicle and drove up the mountain road and arrived at the house in the early afternoon. He went directly to his study and sat at the desk and returned to the notes he had been working on for the formal petition, and this time he finished them. The process under PAC law was clear in its mechanics, if not in its precedent. An Alpha King could, in circumstances where the usual petitioner was unavailable, initiate a formal review on behalf of a deceased PAC member's known companion. The review required documentation, a statement of the nature of the relationship, and the Alpha King's formal endorsement. It went before the full Elder Council for a vote, where a simple majority was required. He knew Marcus would vote no, that was certain. Grace was harder to predict. She was traditional, but she was also deeply fair, and she had heard the full account of Ethan's connection to Lyra, with an expression that was more thoughtful than closed. Peter almost always voted with the majority that formed first, which meant he would go where Grace went. He needed Grace. He wrote out the full documentation over the course of the afternoon, working from Ethan's service record, from Owen's findings, from what Lyra had told him, and what the letter had said. He wrote a formal statement of the relationship's nature and duration. He wrote Callum's endorsement last, in the particular formal language that the PAC law required, and then he read through the whole thing twice, and changed one word in the endorsement, and read it again. It was correct. He sent a message to Marcus informing the council that he would be presenting a formal matter for their review the following Monday. He gave no details. Marcus's reply came within the hour and said only, "We will be present." The week moved. Tuesday came. She was at the grave when he arrived, which was unusual. She had come even earlier than he had for the first time since the November visit. She was standing looking at the stone with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned into the cold wind. He came to stand beside her. She glanced at him and then looked back at the stone. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "about the formal process. I'm presenting it on Monday," he said. She turned and looked at him. Something crossed her face that was more than relief and less than certainty, the expression of someone who is beginning to believe in a direction but has not yet arrived there. "And if it doesn't go well?" she said. "It will go well," he said. He said it without qualifications, because he meant it without qualifications. He had done everything that could be done to make it go well. Now he had to trust the preparation. She held his gaze for a moment. "You're very certain," she said. "I am," he said. She looked at the stone. She was quiet for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said. "If things had gone differently, if he had introduced you properly, the way he was planning to." She paused. "He would have liked that you take things seriously. He thought that was a rare quality." Callum looked at the name on the stone. "I respected him enormously," he said. It came out simply, without any decoration, because the simple thing was the true thing. "I did not know him as well as I should have. That is something I cannot change. But what I knew of him was enough to understand why you are here, why you keep coming." She looked at him. "Why do you keep coming?" she said. And then, before he could answer, she shook her head slightly. I know, you don't have to say it. They stood at the grave for a long time after that, talking sometimes and not talking sometimes, and the cold settled in around them, and neither of them moved to leave. It was the longest either of them had stayed on a single Tuesday, and neither of them mentioned it. She said, sometime after the dark had fully settled, I would like to know what this place is, properly. Not the outline of it, the actual thing. He looked at her. Are you sure? Ethan's letter told me enough to know the shape of it, she said. You've been careful not to confirm or expand on that over the past months. I understand why. But I think we are past the point where careful is the same as kind. He thought about that for a moment. She was right. He had been cautious with information, because the situation had not yet been settled, and giving her the full picture of the pack world, before her standing in it was established, felt like giving someone a map of a house they might still be locked out of. But Monday was coming, and the documentation was ready, and the caution had served its purpose. He told her, not quickly, not carelessly, but fully and honestly. He told her what the pack was. He told her what it meant to be what he was, what Ethan had been, what the land and the burial ground and the founding laws all represented. He told her about the history that went back through his family's line, and further back than that, to the original settlement of the pack in these hills. He told her what the formal recognition he was seeking for her would mean, not that she was part of the pack in the same way as a born or initiated member, but that she was recognized as belonging to one of them, which meant she had standing, which meant she could not be turned away. She listened to all of it. She did not interrupt, did not question, did not look afraid. She held all of it in the same complete attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, He was going to tell me all of this. Yes, Callum said. And he died before he could. Yes. She looked at the stone. She pressed her lips together for just a moment, and then she let out a long breath. Then you telling me, she said, is the next closest thing. He had not thought of it in those exact terms. But standing in the dark of the burial ground with her, it felt true. He had told her the thing Ethan had been working toward telling her. He had completed the sentence Ethan had started. That was not the same as Ethan telling her. Nothing would be the same as that. But it was something. It was real and specific, and it was the next closest thing. And Ethan had written in a letter that the people here were good people, even when the situation made them seem otherwise, and Callum intended to be exactly what Ethan had written. Monday, he said. I'll let you know what happens. She nodded. I'll be at the shop, she said. Come whenever. They walked to the road together. At the edge of the forest, she stopped and turned to face him, and he could see in her face the particular combination of things, the grief that was always there, and underneath it, something that had not been there in the first weeks. Something that was quieter than grief and more durable. Trust, possibly, or the beginning of it. The kind that builds up not from being told to trust someone but from watching them behave trustworthily over time, in small, consistent ways, in the specific manner that changes the quality of the air between two people. She said goodnight. He watched her go. He walked back through the burial ground. He stood at the grave. Monday, he said to the stone. I'll make it right. The stone stood in the dark and said nothing, which was what stones did, and he turned and walked home through the winter forest, with the cold air on his face, and the particular feeling of someone who has decided what they are going to do, and is ready to do it. The Elder Council convened on Monday at the pack's formal meeting hall, which was a long, low stone building set at the back of the main property. It had been built by Callum's grandfather, and had been used for every formal council meeting since. The walls were thick, and the windows were narrow, and the table at the center was long enough for 12, but was never occupied by more than 8, because the Dre Pack did not believe in large councils. They believed in small ones, where each person at the table was there because they were necessary, and not because of ceremony. Callum arrived early. He set his documentation on the table in front of his seat and arranged it without opening it. He did not need to open it. He had read it so many times over the past 2 weeks that it had become part of him. Marcus arrived next, then Grace, then Peter. They sat in their usual positions. Callum looked at each of them in turn and then began. He presented the formal review request in the precise, complete manner that pack law required. He stated the nature of the relationship, its duration, its seriousness, its significance to the pack member in question. He cited Ethan Morrow's 9 years of service and his conduct record, both of which were beyond challenge. He described the documentation he had assembled. He presented his formal endorsement. Then he placed the petition on the table and slid it toward the center. Marcus was already opening his mouth when Grace reached out and took the petition first. She read it. She took her time. The room was quiet enough that the sound of the wind against the narrow windows was clearly audible. Peter looked at his hands. Marcus looked at Grace. When Grace finished, she set the petition down and looked at Callum. "How long did you know about this relationship before initiating the formal process?" she said. 2 months, Callum said. "I used that time to ensure I had an accurate and complete picture before bringing an incomplete one to the council." Grace nodded slowly. She looked at the petition again for a moment. "The relationship was of 3 years' duration," she said. "Confirmed through multiple sources," Callum said. "And the woman has been visiting the burial ground for 14 months. "Yes." Marcus spoke then. He had been holding himself very still for the past few minutes, which was not his natural mode, and when he spoke, Callum could hear that the stillness had been the particular effort of waiting for the right opening. "The formal process," Marcus said, "requires a living petitioner who is a current pack member in good standing. The Alpha King has invoked his authority to substitute for the usual petitioner. I would like the council to note that this substitution, while technically within the Alpha King's authority, does not have a precedent in the pack's documented history." "I'm aware of that," Callum said. "I'm prepared to discuss it." "The lack of precedent," Marcus said, "is not incidental. The formal process requires a living petitioner, because the bond between a pack member and their companion must be actively affirmed by the pack member themselves. A deceased member cannot affirm the bond. The Alpha King's substitution cannot serve the same purpose." Callum had been ready for this argument. He had prepared for it specifically because it was Marcus's strongest ground, the one where the traditional framework was most clearly on his side. He took a breath and answered directly. "A living petitioner affirms the bond," he said. "I agree with that requirement. I am not substituting for that affirmation. The affirmation exists. It exists in 3 years of a documented relationship, in a letter written by Ethan Morrow, before his final mission, that specifically asked this woman to come to this land, and to be received here, and in the formal petition that Ethan Morrow filed with this council 7 months before his death." The room went very still. Marcus did not move. Grace looked up from the table. Peter's head came up for the first time in several minutes. "What formal petition?" Grace said. Callum looked at Marcus. He had rehearsed this moment too. He had found the reference to the petition 3 weeks earlier, buried in a footnote inside the Elder Council's internal correspondence archive that Owen had helped him access. It was 2 lines in the minutes from a private elder session held 8 months before Ethan's death. The minutes noted that a petition had been received from senior patrol warrior Ethan Morrow requesting formal recognition of his human companion under the Companion Recognition Clause. The minutes noted that the petition was declined by the council and the petitioner informed. The minutes were signed by Marcus. Callum had read those 2 lines many times. "There is a record in the Elder Council's archive," Callum said, looking at Marcus, "of a petition filed by Ethan Morrow, requesting formal recognition of his companion. The petition was declined by the council, without my knowledge, without my involvement, and, I will note, without being escalated to the Alpha King, as the pack law requires when a petition of this category is declined at the council level." Grace turned to look at Marcus. Marcus held Callum's gaze. His expression was composed. He was not a man who showed discomfort easily, which was one of the things that made him an effective elder, and also one of the things that made him difficult to work with. "The petition was declined," he said, "because the council determined that the circumstances did not meet the threshold for recognition. The Companion Recognition Clause requires that the relationship be of demonstrated mutual commitment, and that the recognition not create unacceptable risk to pack stability." "On what basis," Callum said quietly, "did the council determine the risk to pack stability?" "On the basis of the surrounding context," Marcus said. "The timing of the petition coincided with a period of significant territorial pressure from the east. The elders judged that introducing a formal recognition process for a human companion at that time was not in the pack's interest. That is a judgment the elders were not authorized to make unilaterally. Callum said. That determination belonged to me. The pack law is clear on that. A declined petition in the companion recognition category must be referred to the Alpha King within 14 days of decline. It was not referred to me. The room was quiet. Callum did not press the point any further. He had made it clearly and cleanly, and he did not need to repeat it. The room had heard it. Grace had heard it, and her expression had changed in a specific way. The way an expression changes when a person has been given information that alters the position they came in holding. He reached into the folder in front of him and withdrew a single page. He slid it to the center of the table. This is a copy of the petition Ethan Morrow filed, he said. The original is in the archive. I am presenting it as part of the documentation for the current formal review. Grace took it. She read it. She held it a little longer than she had held the main petition. When she looked up, her expression was settled in a different way than when she had arrived. I would like a brief recess, she said. Callum sat back in his chair. Of course, he said. The three elders stood and moved to the corner of the room. Callum did not watch them. He looked at the table and let the conversation happen at whatever pace it needed to happen. After 12 minutes, they came back. Grace sat down. She looked at Callum. The council will vote, she said. Marcus said, no. Peter looked at Grace. Grace looked at Peter for a moment, with the patient clarity of someone who has already made up her mind and is giving the other person the courtesy of their own process. After a moment, Peter said, yes. Grace said, yes. Marcus looked at Callum for a long moment. His expression was controlled. He was not going to say anything further, and they both knew it. Callum looked at the three of them. Noted, he said. I'll prepare the formal recognition document this week. He gathered the papers from the table and put his coat on and walked out into the winter morning. The air outside the meeting hall was very cold and very clear, and he stood in it for a moment before walking back to the house. He took out his phone. He wrote a short message to Lyra. It is done. He sent it and put the phone back in his pocket. He walked home through the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and something moving in his chest that was lighter than anything had been in 14 months. Her reply came in less than 2 minutes. One word. Really? He looked at the word for a moment. He wrote back, really. Then he added, I'm coming to tell you about the petition. Stay at the shop. He drove down to the town. The mountain road was icy at the top and clear by the valley, and he took it at a pace that reflected the road rather than his urgency, because getting to her quickly was less important than getting to her whole. He parked at the edge of the lower district and walked the rest of the way, the same approach he had used on Thursday the previous week. The shop was open. Nora was at the front counter and looked at him with the same combination of curiosity and discretion she had applied on Thursday. He appreciated that Lyra had a friend who was careful with her private business. Lyra came from the back. She had flour on her hands, which told him she had been doing something in the small kitchen behind the arrangement room, which was where she sometimes retreated when the shop was quiet and she needed something to do with her hands. She wiped them on her apron and came through and stopped just past the door frame. She looked at him. Come through, she said. He followed her into the back room. She closed the door. She turned and stood with her back to the counter and crossed her arms and looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. Holding hope very carefully, holding readiness for disappointment equally carefully, and somewhere beneath both of those, something that looked like the first edge of something it had not permitted itself to be yet. Tell me everything, she said. He told her everything. He told her about the vote. Grace and Peter, 2-1. He told her what the formal recognition meant under pack law. He told her that her standing was now documented, that she had a right to the burial ground that no one in the pack could override, that the Tuesday visits were no longer a matter of trespass but of recognized access. He watched her face as he spoke. He watched the thing behind her eyes change, shift, adjust to the information. She was very still. She did not move. She listened to every word and held it. Then he told her about the petition. He told her what Ethan had done 7 months before he died. The formal request, submitted through the official channel, asking for Lyra Hale to be formally recognized. He told her about the 2-line entry in the archive minutes. He told her that the petition had been declined by the Elder Council without being referred to Callum, which was a violation of the process that had given him the grounds to overturn the original decision, and initiate a new review on different terms. He told her that Ethan had tried, that he had not just been working toward the conversation, he had already started the formal process, 8 months before the canyon, before the October morning, before the letter. He had already gone to the council and put his name on a piece of paper and asked for her to be recognized as his. She pressed one hand over her mouth. She kept it there for a long moment. He waited. He did not look away, did not move toward her, did not give her anything to respond to, except the space to receive what she had just been given. Then she took her hand down. Her eyes were very red and very bright, and she was not going to cry in front of him. He could see that. She was holding it, with everything she had. She looked at the far wall for a moment. He went to the council, she said. Yes, Callum said. He went formally. He submitted something official. Yes. She pressed her lips together. She was breathing slowly and deliberately, which he recognized as the specific breathing of someone who has trained themselves to stay composed through things that would otherwise break through. He was not just working toward it, she said. He had already begun. Yes, Callum said. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, he saw something in them that he had not seen before in 14 months of standing beside her in the dark and the cold. It was not happiness, that was not the right word for what she was looking at. But it was something that hope becomes when it receives confirmation. Something that was the weight of years of carrying an incomplete picture, suddenly becoming complete. He tried, she said. Simply. The 2 words were enough. He tried, Callum said. She stood in the back room of her flower shop and let that be true for a moment. He stood across from her and gave her the full space of it. After a while she unfolded her arms and looked at him with clear, steady eyes. Thank you, she said. He said, you needed to know. She nodded. I needed to know, she said. I really did. Outside, through the small window above the counter, the winter light moved over the rooftops of the lower market district, and the sky was pale and clear, and very cold. And neither of them moved for another minute, just standing in the small room, with the information between them, and the familiar smell of stems and water, and earth all around, and something that had been heavy for a very long time, resting differently. Nora knocked on the door of the back room and said she was going to get lunch, if that was all right, and would be back in 40 minutes. Lyra said that was fine. They heard the front door of the shop open and close. Stay, she said to Callum. If you can. There is something I want to ask you. He sat down on the tall stool near the counter. She put the kettle on. She made tea with the automatic ease of someone who made it many times a day, setting the cups on the counter and putting her hands on the counter's edge and looking at the window while the kettle heated. When you found the petition, she said, did it say specifically what Ethan had written in it? His own words? It did, Callum said. She turned her head to look at him. Is it something you can tell me? He had thought about this. He had thought about how much of the petition she needed to hear. He had read Ethan's own words in the petition, brief, precise, in the direct language Ethan used for everything, and he had decided before he came down to the town that she deserved to hear them. He reached into his inside coat pocket and withdrew the copy he had made. He had made it before arriving at the meeting that morning, before he had been certain how the vote would go, because he had decided she was going to hear what Ethan had written, regardless of the vote's outcome. He unfolded it and held it so he could read from it. The Companion Recognition Clause petition, submitted by Senior Patrol Warrior Ethan Morrow, states the following, he said. And then, reading directly from Ethan's section, I am petitioning for formal recognition of my companion Lyra Hale, who has been part of my life for 3 years, and who I intend to make part of my world in the fullest sense available to me. She is not aware of the petition. I am submitting it first because I want to ensure that when I tell her everything, she will already have a place here that cannot be taken away. I want her safety to be established before her knowledge of the situation is complete. That is the order in which I have always tried to protect her, and I see no reason to change it now. He stopped reading. The kettle clicked off. Lyra did not move. He continued. She does not know what I am. She has accepted, without asking for explanation, that there is a part of my life she cannot yet access, and she has waited with a patience I do not feel I have deserved. I intend to remedy that as soon as the formal recognition is secured. My request to the council is simple. Give her the standing before she knows she needs it. That is the only thing I am asking for." He folded the paper. Lyra had her eyes closed. She stood at the counter with the untouched kettle beside her, and her hands flat on the counter's edge, and her eyes closed, and she was very still, and after a long moment she said, very quietly, "That's exactly what he would have written." "Yes," Callum said. "I recognized him in it. He always took care of things in the right order," she said. "Safety first, always, and then the knowing." She opened her eyes. They were very red now, and she made no effort to hide that. "He wanted me to already have a place here before he told me what here was." "Yes," Callum said. She looked at the window. "I have it now," she said. "You have it now," he said. She nodded once. She poured the tea. She handed him his cup and took hers and wrapped both hands around it. "I'm sorry it took so long," Callum said. She looked at him over the top of the cup. "You're here now," she said. "That counts." He came back to the town on Friday. He had not planned to come back so soon. He had thought that Monday and Thursday and the revelation of the petition and the formal recognition had been enough for 1 week. He had thought she probably needed a few days to sit with it before the next thing arrived. But he had something that had been in him since the night he read Ethan's name on the stone, something that he had told her he would tell her, something he had promised he would say when the ground was solid enough. The ground was solid now. He had made it solid. He had done the thing he said he would do, and now the other thing was still waiting, and leaving it waiting past this point felt like a choice rather than a necessity. He could not leave it as a choice anymore. She was at the shop when he arrived, in the front this time, arranging the window display. She saw him through the glass and came to the door and opened it. She looked at his face. "Something's happened," she said. "Nothing new," he said. "I need to tell you the thing I said I would tell you, the part I played." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. Nora was not there. The shop was quiet, the kind of quiet that came in the mid-morning when the first rush of the day had passed. She locked the front door and turned the sign so that the closed side faced the street. He did not comment on this. She had made a judgment about what the next hour required, and it was a correct judgment. She sat in the chair behind the counter. He sat on the stool. He told her. He told her everything he knew about the night of the 13th of October, going into the 14th. The intelligence that arrived at 2:30 in the morning. The map on the table. The calculation. And he was precise about calling it a calculation rather than a decision, because that was what it had been. A calculation done correctly, based on available information and strategic principles that were sound. He did not soften that. He did not make it sound smaller than it was, or dress it as something more palatable. He told her that he had selected the unit based on their capabilities and the demands of the terrain, and that the unit had been led by Ethan Morrow, and that the mission had succeeded, and that Ethan had not come back from it. He told her that the order had been his, not delegated, not suggested, his. She sat across from him, and she was very still while he spoke. He finished. The silence that followed was not like any of the silences he had sat in with her before. Those silences were settled or thoughtful or gentle. This one was different. It had a density to it. He sat in it, and he did not move, and he did not look away from her. She was looking at her hands, folded in her lap. After a long moment she said, "You made the call." "Yes," he said. "And the mission worked." "Yes." "And he died in it." "Yes." She was quiet again. He let her be quiet. Whatever she needed to do with what he had told her, she needed to do it without him hurrying her toward a response. He had been carrying the specific version of this moment in his head since the night he stood at the grave and read the name for the second time. He had imagined it as something he could prepare for, something he could approach with precision and care, and the right words and the right delivery. What he had not fully anticipated was how it would feel to be sitting 3 feet from her while she processed it. He had been in difficult conversations before. He had delivered hard news, received hard news, sat at tables where the weight of decisions was enormous. He had been in all of those situations, and he had been steady in all of them. He was not entirely steady now. He stayed still anyway. "You didn't know," she said finally. It was not a question. It was not an exoneration either. It was a fact she was placing alongside the other facts, seeing where it fit. "I didn't know about you," he said. "I knew I was sending him. I knew what I was asking. I made the calculation believing it was the right one. Was it? She said. Do you still believe that? He held the question carefully. She deserved the honest answer, not the comfortable one. I believe the strategic basis for the order was correct, he said. I believe the decision was made with every piece of information I had available. I also believe that the decision cost something I did not account for, because I did not know it existed. Whether those two things can both be true at the same time. He paused. I have been living with that question for 14 months. She looked up from her hands and looked at him. She was not crying. She was not angry. She had the particular expression of someone who has been given information that does not fit neatly into any of the categories available, and who is not trying to force it into one. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask me anything, he said. If you had known, she said, if you had known about me, about us, before that night, would the order have been different? He thought about the answer with the weight it deserved. He sat with it for a real moment, a full one, before he spoke. I don't know, he said. I believe the strategic necessity would have been the same. I believe the mission was necessary. I also believe that knowing what the cost was, specifically, personally, would have made it one of the hardest decisions I have ever made, rather than one that felt like a calculation. And I cannot tell you which way a harder decision would have gone. She nodded slowly. That's an honest answer, she said. It's the only kind I have for you, he said. She looked at the window. The morning light was coming through the glass of the front display, and laying itself across the flowers in the case, and across the counter between them. She looked at the light for a while. Then she said, He spoke about you. I told you that, on the hill. You did, he said. He spoke about you the way that people speak about someone they would follow into something very difficult, she said. Not blindly, not without their own judgment, but because they believed in the person leading them, and they had reasons for that belief that went beyond obligation. She paused. He knew the risk, every time he went on a mission. He knew that was part of what he had signed up for. He was not a man who signed up for things without understanding them. She looked at Callum. He chose to be part of what you built. That was his choice. All the way through. Callum looked at her. That doesn't make it smaller, she said. What happened? It doesn't make it smaller, and I'm not trying to make it smaller. She was looking at him very directly. But I am not going to hold it against you. I decided that a long time ago, before I knew your name, before I knew anything, except that a man came out of the trees on a cold night and walked me to the road and said all right, when I told him I was coming back. She paused. I decided you were trying to be right about something. I don't know how to explain it better than that. He looked at her for a long moment. I am sorry, he said. He said it simply, without qualifying it, without building anything around it. Just those 3 words, in the precise weight they needed to carry. She received them, she let them land. She did not minimize them, and she did not dramatize them. She accepted them, the way someone accepts something that was owed, and has finally arrived, with a quiet kind of relief, that is not happiness but is real. I know, she said. They sat in the closed shop with the morning light between them and the flowers all around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence this time was different from all the silences before it. It was not settled or gentle or thoughtful. It was something that comes after the hardest thing is said and received and acknowledged and held by 2 people who are both still there afterward. It was the silence of 2 people who have told each other the truth and survived it. He sat in it with her and did not hurry it. After a long while, she unlocked the front door and turned the sign back to open, and he helped her carry some of the heavier arrangement pieces from the back room to the front, because she had mentioned the week before that the Saturday order was the biggest they had taken on in a year, and the pieces were unwieldy to move alone. They worked in the quiet shop for an hour. She showed him where things went. He put them there. It was ordinary, and it was specific, and it was exactly the right thing to be doing. When he left, she stood at the door of the shop and looked at him and said, Tuesday? Tuesday, he said. The Tuesday after the Friday was different from every other Tuesday that had come before it. He arrived early, as had become his habit in the recent months. The hillside was cold, but the sky above it was one of those clear January skies that were almost painful to look at directly, the kind of pure, cold blue that existed only in the deepest part of winter, when the air had been swept completely clean by weeks of frost. He stood at the grave and looked at the sky above the bare trees and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was not something he permitted himself often. She came up the path with her flowers and stopped when she saw him, as usual. She stood for a moment and then walked the rest of the way. "Good morning," she said. It was the first time she had said those specific words to him in all the Tuesdays they had shared. He thought about that for a moment. "Good morning," he said. She arranged the flowers at the base of the stone. She did it slowly today, more slowly than her usual practiced pace, as though she was giving each one specific placement. When she finished, she stood and looked at the stone for a long moment. "I thought about what you told me on Friday," she said. He waited. "I thought about it all weekend," she said. "I went through the whole thing many times. The canyon, the order, the mission, what you knew and what you didn't know. I turned it over from every angle I could find." She paused, "And I came back to the same place every time. He chose to follow you. He chose to be part of the pack, part of what you led. He had 9 years to make a different choice. He didn't. That has to mean something." "It means something," Callum said. "I'm not saying it was simple," she said. "I'm not saying Friday was simple, or that the months before Friday were simple. I'm saying that I am not going to spend the rest of my life allocating the grief to the wrong address. He died doing what he had chosen to do, under someone he had chosen to trust. That is not the same as a mistake." He looked at the name on the stone. "I want you to stop carrying it alone too," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the stone, but she was speaking to him. "You've been carrying the part you played for 14 months, she said. "Alone, without anyone to say it to. I know that, because he would have been the person you said it to, and he is the person it is about." She looked at him then. "You can say it to me, as many times as it needs to be said. I'm not going anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in him that he had not permitted to move before, because he had not known where to put it. It was not grief exactly, and not guilt exactly, and not relief exactly. It was something that was made of all three of those things, and that had been standing in him without a place to go for a very long time, and the weight of it was something he had become so accustomed to that he had almost stopped registering it as weight. He registered it now. "Thank you," he said. It was not adequate, and he knew it, but it was the truest thing available. She nodded once. She looked back at the stone. They stood at the grave for a long time that Tuesday. The winter light moved across the hillside slowly, and the bare trees stood around them, and the cold was present but not sharp, the particular January cold that had settled in for the long stretch of winter, and had stopped being dramatic about it. He thought about all the Tuesdays they had stood here, the first night, the waking, the walk to the road, the weeks after that when the story had built piece by piece in the cold and the dark until it was complete enough to hold both of them. He thought about the petition in Ethan's handwriting, the specific order Ethan had thought it through in. Establish her safety before her knowledge, give her the place before she knows she needs it. He thought about what it had taken to be that kind of person, and he thought about the fact that she was here, that she had come every week for 14 months, alone, carrying the grief and the letter and the unanswered questions, and she had not dissolved under any of it. She had remained exactly herself, steady, direct, honest, present, and she had extended that steadiness to him on a frozen hillside in October, without any particular reason to do so. That was not a small thing. He had been thinking about it for a long time. At the road that day, she turned and said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and then she turned back. "One thing," she said. He waited. "Ethan wanted me to be here," she said. "That is why I started coming. But it is not the only reason I keep coming." She held his gaze for just a moment, then she turned and walked up the road. He stood at the edge of the forest in the cold and watched her go, and thought about that for a long time. He walked back through the burial ground slowly. The bare trees stood in the January dark, with the last of the light going out of the sky above them, and the stone was exactly where it always was, and the name on it was exactly as it had always been. He stood in front of it for one more minute. He thought about what Ethan had written. Safety before knowledge. Place before knowing. He thought about what it would mean to do the next thing correctly, in the same order, with the same quality of care. He walked home through the dark and sat at his desk for a long time, and let the evening settle around him. He knew what came next. He was not ready to rush it. That was the thing he had learned from all of it, from the weeks and the months, and the Tuesdays and the letter and the petition and the vote and the Friday and all the conversations in between, that the right things happened in the right order, and the right order was not always the fastest one, and patience was not the same as delay. He turned the desk lamp off. He sat in the dark for a while. He would do it in the right order. That was what he owed to both of them. Spring came to the burial ground, the way spring always did in this part of the hills. Not all at once, but in increments that you only noticed when you stopped looking for the grand announcement and started paying attention to the small ones. First, the ground changed. The packed cold soil of winter became something looser, something that gave slightly under a boot heel in a way it had not for months. Then the color came back into the grass, not dramatically, not in any single morning, but in a slow, definite migration of green from the lower edges of the hillside upward, as though the earth had decided it was time and was taking its own pace about getting there. Then the trees changed. The bare branches that had been the only visible architecture of the burial ground for 4 months began to put out the first pale suggestions of leaves, that particular soft yellow-green that existed nowhere else in the color spectrum, that came and went in about a week before it became the full green of summer. Callum noticed all of this in the way that people notice things they have been in a place long enough to track. He had been walking these grounds for 30 years. He knew what winter looked like on this hill, what spring looked like, what the particular quality of the light was in April as opposed to January. He knew the way the wildflowers came back. This year, the wildflowers at Ethan Morrow's grave came back without being replanted. Lyra had been pressing flowers into the ground around the stone since the autumn. He had watched her do it over several Tuesdays, small, specific actions, pushing stems into the earth at the base of the stone and along the edges of the small area she tended each week. He had not asked her about it directly. She had not explained it directly. But he had understood, watching her, that she was attempting to root something, to create something that would remain through the winter and come back when the season changed. He had not known whether it would work. On a Tuesday, in the second week of April, he arrived at the grave before her and found that it had worked. The flowers were there, not planted fresh, not brought in her hands. They were growing. Small yellow ones and white ones, and a cluster of the purple thin-stemmed ones along the left side of the stone, all of them in full early bloom, all of them having come back on their own from the roots she had spent months establishing. The grass around the stone was greener than the grass elsewhere on the hillside, as though the constant attention and the pressed stems and the regular presence of someone who cared had made the earth more willing in that specific spot. He stood in front of the grave and looked at the flowers for a long time. The morning was warm. That was the other thing about April on this hillside. The mornings could be genuinely warm, in a way that February and March could only threaten at. The sun came over the eastern ridge at a low angle and hit the stone and the flowers and the green grass around them with a warmth that was not symbolic, but simply physical, simply real. The kind of warmth that made everything it touched look like it was doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing. He heard her coming up the path. She came around the oak and stopped. He turned to look at her and watched what happened on her face when she saw the flowers. It was brief and very specific, a caught breath, barely visible, and then a stillness, and then something that settled into her expression that he had been watching for over months, and that looked, from this angle, in this light, like something that had finally arrived at its destination. She walked the rest of the way and stood beside him. She looked at the flowers for a long time without speaking. "The yellow ones are from October," she said finally. "I pressed them in just before the first frost. I wasn't sure they would hold through." "They held," he said. "They held," she said. She crouched down and looked at the flowers closely, turning her head slightly to see their position at the base of the stone. She reached out and touched one of the yellow blooms very gently with 2 fingers. Then she stood. "He would have loved this," she said. It was a simple statement, no performance in it, just a fact about a person she had known. "The garden he talked about," Callum said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "something like this." They stood side by side in the April morning, with the warm light on their backs, and the wildflowers at the base of the stone, and the sound of birds in the trees around them. Birds that had not been here since October. Birds that had come back the same way everything came back, in the slow, certain way of things that had not been lost, but only absent for a season. He bent down and picked one of the yellow flowers that had grown slightly to the side of the others, tilted away from the stone. He set it back against the base of the marker, tucking the stem into the grass so it would stand. He did it carefully, with the same specific quality of attention she brought to arranging flowers. Then he stood. She had been watching. She did not say anything, but he felt the weight of her seeing it. Neither of them looked away from the stone, but both of them were aware of the other standing there in the morning. He thought about the formal recognition document that was now filed and complete, the one that had been officially delivered to the PAC Records office 6 weeks earlier. Lyra Hale, recognized companion of Ethan Morrow, deceased member of the Dre PAC, granted standing on PAC land, including access to the burial ground in perpetuity. The language was dry, as formal language always was, but the meaning beneath it was the thing Ethan had asked for in his petition. Safety before knowledge, place before knowing. She had the place now. She had had it since January, on paper. Since October of last year, in reality, she had had it. Since the first Tuesday night, when she had told an Alpha King standing in the dark that she was going to come back, and he had said all right. He thought about the rightness of that, the particular way things had moved toward this morning, in small, consistent steps, none of which had felt like a grand gesture at the time, all of which had built something real. After a while they turned, without planning it, and walked together back through the burial ground, past the older graves in the lower section, past the ancient oak, up the slope toward the forest path, walking the same ground they had walked on a cold October night when she was half asleep, and he was still carrying a name he had just read for the first time, in a new way. The path was different in April. Everything was. The light came through the trees differently, more fully, without the bare architecture of winter filtering it. The ground was soft underfoot. The branches above them were full enough to create the particular dappled quality of spring forest light, moving and settling, the kind of light that made you feel like you were walking inside something breathing. They came out at the road. She stopped and turned. She had her coat in her arm, the spring morning warm enough to not need it. Her hair was down in the sun, and she looked at him in the direct, unhurried way she always looked at him, the way she looked at things she had decided were worth looking at carefully. "I'm going to open the shop," she said. "I have things to attend to," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. The road was empty this early in the morning, the only sound the birds, and the very distant sound of the valley below, waking up. "Thank you for coming today," she said. "I'll be here next week," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. It was not the look of someone who had been given a promise and was deciding whether to believe it. It was the look of someone who already believed it, who had believed it for a long time, who was simply letting that belief be visible for a moment before putting it back where she usually kept it. She nodded once. She put her coat over her arm and turned and walked up the road in the April morning. He watched her the same way he had watched her on that first cold night, until the road bent and she was gone from his line of sight. He stood at the edge of the forest. He thought about Ethan Morrow's letter, the specific instruction, "Go there. The people are good people. I want those two parts of my life to not have been entirely separate forever." He thought about how that had worked out, not perfectly. Not in the way Ethan had intended, which would have been Ethan himself standing in the spring morning, showing her the wildflowers at his own grave, but in the way that was available, in the way that real things happened, slowly, honestly, imperfectly, with cost, and then arriving at something that was still real. He turned and walked back into the forest. He walked through the burial ground slowly, not heading anywhere in particular, just walking the ground, the way he had walked it for 30 years, the way he intended to walk it for 30 more. Past the ancient markers in the lower section, past Ethan's stone with the wildflowers standing in the April warmth, past the oak. He came out on the east side of the hill, where the land opened up onto the long slope that ran down toward the valley. He stood there for a while in the morning sun, with the whole valley visible below him, the town where she lived, the lower market district, the shop with the closed sign that would be turned in an hour or two. He thought about what came next. He thought about it without urgency. The right things happened in the right order, in the right time, and rushing them did not make them more right. He had learned that. He was still learning it. He thought he would be learning it for a long time, and he was, for the first time in a very long time, all right with that. He did not hurry back to the house. He walked down the eastern slope at a pace that matched the morning, steady, unhurried, in the spring sun, with the particular feeling of someone who has put down something heavy and has not yet decided what to pick up next. That feeling was not empty. It was the thing that came before the next right step. He was beginning to understand that. The weight going down did not leave nothing in its place. It left space. Space for what came at the right pace, in the right order, in the way that things built to last were built. Somewhere behind him on the hill, in the burial ground, the wildflowers bent very slightly in the April wind. The stone stood in the morning light, exactly as it had for many months, with the name on it held by two people who had known the same man from entirely different directions, and who had built, in the long weeks of learning that, something that neither of them had set out to build, but that was real, and durable, and theirs. The valley below the hill woke up slowly in the morning light. The town went from dark windows to lit ones. The market district began to sound like itself. A shop sign turned from closed to open. On the hill, the wildflowers grew. He went home and changed his coat and came back downstairs and stood in the kitchen and made himself breakfast, which was not something he did every morning, but which felt right on this particular morning, the way ordinary things feel right after something significant has shifted. He thought about the vote, which had been 3 months ago now. He thought about Grace and Peter and Marcus, and the way the room had held the information about the petition. He thought about Marcus's expression when Callum walked out of the meeting hall, the controlled composure of a man who has not won and knows it and is deciding how to carry that. Callum had not made it harder than it needed to be. He had no interest in making Marcus a defeated enemy. He had an interest in the decision being made and being final, and it was both. He thought about Owen, who had done the work that made all of it possible, the quiet investigation in the town, the archive research, the trip to the market records, the observation of Clara, and the Friday encounter with Felix. Owen had not once asked what Callum intended to do with the information. He had simply found it and given it and trusted Callum's judgment, which was what a good beta did, and which Callum had taken note of and would not forget. He thought about Clara, who had been at the market by coincidence on a Friday morning, and had seen a woman hold her ground against Felix with her hands shaking, and had decided to let Owen know. Clara, who was careful and perceptive, and who had not made a thing of it and had not needed to be asked. He would need to acknowledge that at some point, not with ceremony. Clara was not the type for ceremony, but with something, because what she had done had mattered. He thought about Nora, whom he had never spoken to directly, who had looked at him with the specific, discreet protectiveness of someone who took care of the people they worked with, and had clearly decided, after the Thursday visit and the Monday visit, that he was not a danger, that the judgment of someone who cared about Lyra, and had watched how she was after their conversations, mattered in a way that no formal process could provide. He thought about Ethan. He thought about Ethan, not for the first time that morning, and knew he would think about him before the morning ended, and at some point in the afternoon, and probably before he went to sleep. That was what it was now, not the acute, cutting grief of the first days after October, not the contained, carefully managed grief of the months that followed, but something that had become part of the ordinary texture of his days, a presence that sat alongside him rather than in front of him, that walked the same ground without impeding anything. He thought that was what Ethan would have wanted. If you could say such a thing without presumption, not to be mourned past the point where mourning was the right shape for the grief, to be remembered in the specific, daily way that people remembered those who had been real and particular and present, rather than preserved in ceremony and set apart. He thought that the wildflowers growing at the base of the stone were a good version of that, specific, alive, growing on their own because someone had pressed the roots into the ground carefully enough in autumn for the spring to find them. He went to his desk in the afternoon. He worked through the correspondence and the boundary reports and the 2 items from Owen that needed his attention, and a long, somewhat involved email from the grain supplier that required a careful response. He did all of it in the ordinary way of ordinary afternoons, and at some point during the working, he realized that the weight he had been carrying, the specific, precise weight of that particular thing, was different now, not gone. He did not think it would be gone, but different in the way that something is different when it has been named and held and witnessed by another person who received it without flinching. She had said, "I am not going to hold it against you." She had said it and she had meant it, and over the months since she said it he had watched her mean it in the practical, daily way that genuine decisions showed up. Not in a single dramatic act of forgiveness, but in the consistent, small reality of continuing to be present, of continuing to come on Tuesdays, of continuing to say his name with the same directness she brought to saying everything. He had needed to hear it said. He had needed to sit across from her in a closed flower shop while she held the information and then gave him the answer she gave him. He did not think he had fully understood how much he needed that until he had it. The afternoon went to evening. He made tea. He went to the window and looked at the hill in the dusk, which was pink and gold in April, in a way that it was in no other season, the light doing specific things to the sky, and the trees, that it reserved for spring evenings. He thought about the word Tuesday. She had said it on the April morning at the road. "He'll be here next week," he had said, and she had looked at him in the way she looked at things she trusted. He thought about what it meant to be someone she trusted. He thought about what Ethan had written, "The most important thing I have ever protected." He thought about the specific ordering of that, not the most important thing I have ever loved, though that was implied, but the most important thing I have ever kept safe. He was beginning to understand what it meant to have that kind of priority. He turned away from the window. He went to the desk. He took out a single sheet of paper and he wrote a note. Not an official document, not in the formal language of pack law, not anything that would be filed anywhere. Just a note, in his own handwriting, brief and clear in the way he preferred. He folded it. He held it for a moment. He was not going to rush anything. He was not going to act before the ground was as solid as it needed to be, which was a lesson he had learned from watching how Ethan had tried to do things, and from understanding what it meant to give someone safety before you gave them knowledge. But he was also not going to mistake patience for inaction. He put the note in the pocket of his coat. He would know when the right Tuesday was.